Sebelum London terbakar, kota itu tidak tampak seperti tempat yang sedang menunggu kehancuran. Ia tampak seperti kota yang sedang pulih. Jalan-jalannya kembali ramai setelah wabah besar. Pasar mulai hidup lagi. Kapal-kapal tetap bergerak di Sungai Thames. Para pedagang menghitung barang, para tukang membuka bengkel, dan keluarga-keluarga kembali percaya bahwa hari esok akan berjalan seperti hari kemarin. Namun justru di dalam rasa biasa itulah bahaya bersembunyi. London tidak hancur karena satu percikan api saja. Ia hancur karena kota itu telah lama dibangun dari kayu, kebiasaan, keyakinan lama, dan keputusan-keputusan kecil yang tampak masuk akal pada masanya. Rumah-rumah terlalu rapat, jalan-jalan terlalu sempit, gudang-gudang terlalu penuh, api terlalu akrab dalam kehidupan sehari-hari. Dan ketika angin kering mulai bergerak melalui lorong-lorong tua itu, seluruh kota sebenarnya sudah siap terbakar, hanya belum ada yang menyadarinya. London pada tahun 1666 adalah kota yang percaya bahwa ia sudah melewati masa terburuknya. Hanya setahun sebelumnya, wabah telah melubangi seluruh lingkungan. Lonceng gereja berdentang begitu sering untuk kematian sampai keheningan sendiri terasa mencurigakan. Namun pada akhir musim panas 1666, kota itu mulai bernapas lagi. Toko-toko dibuka kembali. Pasar terisi. Anak-anak kembali ke ganggang sempit dan wharves di tepi sungai. Kehidupan, dengan segala kekasaran dan kekacauannya, telah kembali ke ritme yang stabil. Orang London terbiasa dengan kesulitan. Api adalah bahaya yang akrab, tetapi juga teman yang akrab. Hearth menyala siang dan malam. Bakery bekerja sepanjang jam gelap. Lilin menerangi hampir setiap ruangan. Api adalah bagian dari kelangsungan hidup sehari-hari, bukan tanda bencana. Kota itu sendiri sudah tua, padat, dan berlapis oleh kebiasaan selama berabad-abad. Rencana jalan abad pertengahan masih membentuk pergerakan orang. Bangunan-bangunan condong ke dalam di atas lane yang sempit. Lantai atas menjorok keluar, seolah berusaha menyentuh bangunan di seberang jalan. Rangka kayu, pitch, tar, dan thatch ada di mana-mana, lebih murah dan lebih cepat digunakan daripada batu. Material-material itu berderit dan menghangat dalam udara kering dari musim panas yang hampir tidak membawa hujan. Hanya sedikit orang yang menganggap ini tidak biasa. Musim panas datang dan pergi. Kebakaran sering terjadi, tetapi biasanya dapat dikendalikan. Buket dioper dari tangan ke tangan. Tetangga berkumpul membantu. Dinding dibongkar jika perlu. London memiliki sistem, tradisi, dan rasa percaya diri. Otoritas di kota juga terasa akrab. Lord Mayor, Aldermen, Parish Officials, dan Watchmen membentuk struktur yang telah mengatur kehidupan urban selama beberapa generasi. Monarki baru saja kembali setelah tahun-tahun civil war dan pergolakan politik. King Charles II kembali duduk di takhta, dan bangsa itu menginginkan stabilitas. London, sebagai pusat perdagangan dan politik, merasakan kebutuhan akan stabilitas itu dengan sangat kuat. Tidak ada banyak ruang untuk alarm. Kota ini menginginkan ketenangan, bukan peringatan. Ketika Sabtu berubah menjadi Minggu, pada tanggal 2 September sebagian besar London tidur, sungai bergerak pelan melewati wharves, membawa bau perdagangan dan pasang surut. Di rumah-rumah di atas toko, keluarga berbaring berdekatan. Di taverns, lilin terakhir menyala rendah. Watchmen memanggil jam. Suara mereka stabil dan rutin. Tidak ada sesuatu di udara yang menunjukkan bahwa malam ini akan dikenang selama berabad-abad. Tidak ada lonceng yang berdentang. Tidak ada perintah yang diteriakkan. Kota itu beristirahat dalam keakrabannya sendiri. Di sebuah bakery kecil di Pudding Lane, dekat tepi sungai, pekerjaan baru saja selesai belum lama. Roti dipanggang pada malam hari agar dapat dijual segar pada pagi hari. Oven besar, sulit dingin, dan dibangun langsung ke dalam struktur kayu. Panas tetap tinggal bahkan setelah roti terakhir dikeluarkan. Ini adalah pengetahuan umum, diterima sebagai bagian dari pekerjaan. Para baker mempercayai pengalaman mereka. Mereka mempercayai bahwa bara akan padam seperti biasanya. Kota yang lebih luas juga mempercayai rutinitasnya dengan cara yang sama. Fire engines, yang pada dasarnya adalah pompa penyemprot air beroda, ditempatkan di beberapa titik. Parish buckets digantung di gereja. Leather buckets disimpan di banyak rumah. Semua ini menciptakan kesan bahwa risiko telah dikelola. London tidak sepenuhnya ceroboh. Tetapi London sudah terbiasa. Bahaya yang akrab jarang terasa mendesak. Di bawah ketenangan itu, kondisi-kondisi penting diam-diam telah sejajar. Musim panas sangat kering. Balok-balok kayu kehilangan kelembapannya. Atap menjadi rapuh. Sungai rendah. Sumur-sumur tidak sepenuh biasanya. Angin timur yang kuat mulai bertiup, mendorong udara dari arah pantai ke daratan. Tidak satu pun dari fakta ini tampak mengkhawatirkan jika dilihat sendiri-sendiri. Namun bersama-sama, semuanya membentuk panggung yang hanya dapat dikenali ketika sudah terlambat. Kehidupan sosial kota terus berjalan tanpa banyak renungan. Para trader bersiap untuk minggu berikutnya. Cartes merencanakan keberangkatan pagi. Para churchgoers menantikan khotbah minggu yang akan berbicara tentang moral order, bukan katastrofe. Ingatan tentang plague telah mengajari orang untuk lebih takut pada penyakit daripada api. Api, bagaimanapun terlihat, api dapat dilawan, penyakit merayap tanpa terlihat. Dibanding penyakit, api terasa jujur. Ada juga kenyamanan psikologis dalam meyakini bahwa bencana besar sudah menjadi milik masa lalu. Great Plague telah menandai generasi ini. Membayangkan kalamiti besar lain yang menimpa seluruh kota terasa berlebihan, hampir tidak masuk akal. Orang London lelah merasa takut. Mereka menginginkan normalitas, dan keinginan itu membentuk apa yang mereka perhatikan dan apa yang mereka abaikan. Bahkan soundscape fisik kota memperkuat rasa tenang itu. Suara malam yang biasa terus berlangsung. Sungai menyentuh tepian. Kuda bergerak di kandang. Tawa terdengar jauh. Sebuah pintu tertutup di suatu tempat. Suara-suara ini memberitahu pikiran bahwa semuanya berjalan sebagaimana mestinya. Tidak ada orang yang mendengarkan dari jendela akan menebak bahwa dalam beberapa jam, suara-suara akrab itu akan digantikan oleh kayu yang retak, batu yang runtuh, dan raungan yang tidak akan berhenti selama berhari-hari. Beginilah Great Fire of London sebenarnya dimulai. Bukan dengan spektakel, melainkan dengan comfort, dengan orang-orang yang mempercayai apa yang selalu mereka percayai, dengan sistem-sistem yang selama ini bekerja, cukup baik untuk menumpulkan imajinasi, dengan kota yang telah bertahan dari war, plague, dan political collapse, lalu meyakini dirinya kuat karena kebiasaan, bukan karena rancangan. Ketika api itu datang, ia akan memperlihatkan bukan hanya bangunan yang mudah terbakar, tetapi juga asumsi-asumsi yang rapuh. Ia akan menunjukkan bagaimana authority ragu di bawah tekanan, bagaimana communities bertindak ketika escape menjadi satu-satunya rencana, dan bagaimana memori membentuk ulang disaster setelah asap hilang. Namun belum ada yang terlihat. Pada saat itu, London hanyalah kota yang sedang beristirahat, percaya diri, penuh sesak, dan diam-diam rentan. Ketika malam semakin dalam, angin terus mendorong dirinya melalui jalan-jalan. Bara mendingin perlahan di dalam oven. Rangka-rangka kayu menyimpan panas hari itu. Di suatu tempat dalam gelap, sebuah kegagalan kecil menunggu untuk menjadi penting. Dan di sekelilingnya, sebuah kota tidur, tidak sadar bahwa ia berdiri di tepi kebakaran paling merusak dalam sejarahnya. London sebelum api bukan satu tempat tunggal, melainkan banyak tempat yang ditekan menjadi satu, dilapisi oleh waktu, kebiasaan, dan kebutuhan. Untuk memahami bagaimana api itu akan bergerak, pertama-tama kita harus memahami bagaimana kota itu hidup. London pada tahun 1666 adalah kota terbesar di England dan termasuk salah satu yang terbesar di Europe. Namun kota ini tumbuh tanpa guiding plan. Jalan-jalannya mengikuti batas properti abad pertengahan, Roman roads, dan jalur yang terbentuk karena pemakaian lama sebelum ada orang yang memikirkan traffic, sanitation, atau emergency access. Apa yang dahulu cukup untuk kota berisi puluhan ribu orang, hanya terus diperluas untuk menampung ratusan ribu. Sebagian besar orang London tinggal dekat dengan tempat kerja mereka. Trades berkumpul berdasarkan tradisi. Bakers, brewers, chandlers, coopers, dan butchers sering bekerja berdampingan, masing-masing bergantung pada api atau panas dalam bentuk tertentu. Smiths menjaga forges tetap menyala. Brewers, merebus, vats. Soap makers melelehkan lemak di atas api terbuka. Industri-industri ini tidak disembunyikan jauh dari permukiman. Mereka dijahit langsung ke dalam kehidupan tempat tinggal. Di atas workshops ada sleeping quarters. Di belakang shops ada kitchens dan storerooms. Api bukan pengecualian dari kehidupan sehari-hari. Api adalah pusatnya. Housing mencerminkan kebutuhan ekonomi sekaligus kebiasaan. Timber frame buildings mendominasi sebagian besar kota. Kayu lebih murah daripada batu dan lebih cepat dipasang. Rumah-rumah dibangun tinggi, bukan lebar, kadang 4 atau 5 lantai, karena tanah di dalam city walls sangat berharga. Setiap tingkat sering menjorok keluar di atas jalan, desain yang dikenal sebagai jettying. Ini memberi ruang interior tambahan, tetapi mempersempit jalan di bawahnya. Di banyak tempat, tetangga dari sisi jalan yang berlawanan hampir dapat menyentuh tangan dari jendela lantai atas mereka. Atap berbeda menurut distrik dan wealth. Sebagian memakai til, sebagian memakai shingle. Banyak bangunan tua atau miskin masih memakai thatch. Walaupun thatch telah dilarang atau tidak dianjurkan setelah kebakaran sebelumnya, enforcement tidak merata, repairs mahal, dan landlords sering menundanya. Tar dan pitch umum digunakan untuk weatherproof roofs dan beams, menambahkan lapisan lain yang mudah terbakar. Di dalam walls, lantai terbuat dari kayu, stairs sempit, dan partitions tipis. Api yang dimulai di satu lantai dapat bergerak cepat ke atas, ditarik oleh panas dan aliran udara seperti chimney. Jalan-jalan sendiri hanya memberi sedikit perlindungan. Mereka sempit, berkelok, dan sering penuh barang. Market stalls meluber ke roadways. Goods ditumpuk di luar shops. Carts, barrels, dan refuse menghalangi movement. Open drains mengalir di tepi jalan, membawa limbah menuju river. Channels ini penting untuk sanitation, tetapi tidak berguna untuk firefighting. Air untuk emergencies harus diambil dari wells, pumps, atau Thames sendiri, lalu dibawa dengan tangan menggunakan leather buckets. Firefighting di London adalah tanggung jawab komunitas, bukan profesi khusus. Setiap parish diharapkan menjaga equipment dasar. Ini mencakup buckets, hooks untuk merobohkan bangunan yang terbakar, ladders, dan kadang hand pump sederhana. Engines ini berat dan lambat, hanya mampu menyemprotkan air dalam jarak pendek. Mereka bekerja paling baik ketika fire masih kecil dan localized. Coordination antar parishes terbatas. Tidak ada Central Fire Authority, tidak ada Unified Command, dan tidak ada standardized training. Ketika kebakaran terjadi, respons standar bergantung pada kecepatan dan judgment. Tetangga membentuk bucket lines. Church bells membunyikan alarm. Officials menilai apakah bangunan dekat api harus dihancurkan untuk menciptakan fire breaks. Keputusan ini membawa konsekuensi legal dan financial. Menghancurkan private property, bahkan untuk menyelamatkan kota, membutuhkan authority dan courage. Compensation tidak pasti. Hesitation umum terjadi, terutama jika api tidak langsung tampak mengancam. Social division semakin memperumit struktur kota. Warga kaya tinggal di rumah yang lebih besar, sering dibangun dengan lebih banyak stone, terutama di areas yang lebih baru. Warga miskin berdesakan di distrik tua, menyewa rooms dalam rumah-rumah yang dibagi-bagi. Overcrowding umum terjadi. Satu bangunan dapat menampung beberapa keluarga, masing-masing memasak dan memanaskan ruang secara terpisah. Privacy terbatas. Kontrol juga terbatas. Satu percikan ceroboh di satu household dapat membahayakan puluhan orang. Religion membentuk ritme harian dan ruang fisik. Churches tersebar di kota, lebih dari 100 di dalam wall saja. Parish boundaries menentukan identitas komunitas. Bells menandai waktu, memanggil worshippers, dan memberi peringatan bahaya. Churches juga menyimpan firefighting equipment dan records. Namun bangunan yang sama, sering besar dan beratap kayu, juga rentan. Mereka berdiri sebagai landmarks dan symbols, tetapi juga sebagai potensial fuel. Commerce mengikat London erat dengan river. Thames adalah arteri utama kota. Goods tiba dengan boat, dan dibongkar di wharves yang padat. Warehouses berhahar di tepi sungai, penuh oil, alkohol, sugar, hemp, spices, dan textiles. Banyak dari material ini mudah terbakar. Barrels ditumpuk tinggi, kadang bocor. Narrow lanes berjalan dari river masuk ke kota, membentuk koridors yang dapat menyalurkan manusia dan api sekaligus. River menyediakan air, tetapi tidak mudah digunakan dalam emergencies. Access points terbatas. Pumps ada, tetapi pressure lemah. Mengambil air memerlukan waktu, dan memindahkannya naik ke dalam kota sangat melelahkan. Gagasan bahwa river saja dapat menyelamatkan London dari major fire lebih menenangkan daripada realistis. Governance menambah lapisan kerumitan lain. City of London diatur secara terpisah dari Crown, dengan officials dan tradition sendiri. Lord Mayor memiliki authority penting di dalam walls, tetapi authority itu diseimbangkan oleh customs, property rights, dan political caution. Keputusan yang memengaruhi merchants atau property owners dapat memicu backlash. Order bergantung pada cooperation sama besar. Seperti pada Koman, di luar city walls, suburbs tumbuh cepat. Areas ini bahkan lebih kurang regulated. Buildings padat, sering dengan sedikit oversight. Banyak residents bekerja di city, tetapi tinggal di luar formal jurisdiction-nya. Fire tidak mengenali boundaries seperti ini. Namun planning jarang memperhitungkan seberapa cepat bahaya dapat bergerak antar districts. Memori juga membentuk behavior. London pernah terbakar sebelumnya, berkali-kali, meskipun tidak pernah dalam skala yang akan datang. Sebagian besar fires dikendalikan dalam beberapa buildings atau satu street. Orang mengingat kejadian-kejadian ini sebagai disruptions, bukan existential threats. Gagasan bahwa fire dapat mengalahkan seluruh city terasa abstrak, hampir teoretikal. Experience telah mengajari Londoners bahwa api dapat dikelola. Keyakinan ini memengaruhi pilihan construction. Bahkan setelah laws mendorong stone dan brick, banyak builders tetap memakai timber jika memungkinkan. Brick lebih berat, lebih mahal, dan lebih lambat dikerjakan. Timber memberi flexibility dan speed. Repair setelah small fires sering dibuat dengan material yang sama dengan yang sebelumnya terbakar. Continuity lebih penting daripada caution. Daily life memperkuat continuity ini. Mornings dimulai lebih awal, markets dibuka saat dawn. Bakers bekerja sepanjang malam. Alley houses ramai pada afternoon. Candles menyala dari sunset sampai tidur. Oil lamps berkelip di windows. Setiap praktik ini melibatkan flame. Safety bergantung pada habit dan attention, bukan teknologi. Sebagian besar waktu ini berhasil. Weather conditions pada akhir summer 1666 diam-diam melemahkan keseimbangan itu. Minggu-minggu tanpa rain mengeringkan beams dan floors. Dust berkumpul. Udara terasa lebih ringan, lebih tajam. Orang-orang menyambut pleasant weather setelah tahun-tahun sickness. Windows dibiarkan terbuka. Fires menyala lebih efisien. Wind bergerak lebih bebas melalui narrow passages kota. Namun tidak ada yang berjalan di street sambil memikirkan disaster. Kota terasa sibuk tetapi biasa. Merchants khawatir tentang prices. Apprentices khawatir tentang masters. Families khawatir tentang rent. Kekhawatiran seperti inilah yang memenuhi ruang pikiran. Ruang yang mungkin dapat digunakan untuk melihat risiko. Kota berfungsi seperti biasanya. Bukan karena aman, tetapi karena familiar. London sebelum api adalah tempat dengan resilience yang dibangun di atas repetition. Orang mempercayai apa yang berhasil kemarin akan berhasil besok. Structures berdiri, karena telah berdiri selama generations. Systems bertahan, karena belum pernah gagal secara katastrofik. Ini bukan kebodohan, melainkan ekonomi pikiran manusia. Disease bertahan dengan mengasumsikan continuity. Tragedi yang akan datang tidak lahir dari ignorance saja. Ia tumbuh dari akumulasi keputusan selama centuries, masing-masing tampak reasonable pada momennya sendiri. Timber murah. Streets hanya diperlebar ketika benar-benar perlu. Authority berkembang perlahan. Dibentuk oleh compromise. Firefighting sudah cukup, sampai suatu hari tidak cukup lagi. Ketika Sunday morning mendekat, kota masih tersusun sama seperti malam sebelumnya. Bakery ovens adalah bagian dari jaringan besar heat sources yang tertanam di dalam wood dan habit. Wind bergerak melalui alleys yang dibentuk oleh medieval plots. River berada di bawah warehouses yang dipenuhi goods. Setiap elemen sudah berada di tempatnya, meskipun tidak seorang pun melihat pattern yang sedang terbentuk. London sebelum fire bukan kota yang ceroboh, tetapi rentan dalam cara yang hanya dapat diungkap oleh katastrofe. Ia adalah kota yang dibangun untuk hidup secara efisien, bukan untuk gagal dengan aman. Dan ketika malam bergeser menuju dawn, perbedaan itu akan menjadi sangat penting dengan cara yang belum dapat dibayangkan siapapun. Musim panas yang gelisah. Musim panas 1666 menetap di atas London dengan kegigihan yang diperhatikan orang, tetapi belum mereka takuti. Ia hangat, kering dan tidak dipatahkan oleh hujan-hujan stabil yang biasanya melembutkan kota pada akhir Agustus. Hari demi hari lewat di bawah langit cerah. Tanah mengeras. Balok-balok kayu dalam rumah-rumah yang sudah tua dan kering, terus kehilangan sisa kelembapan. Atap sedikit berderit ketika suhu berubah antara siang dan malam. Semua ini adalah sensasi kecil, mudah diabaikan, terlipat ke dalam ketidaknyamanan biasa kehidupan kota. Orang London sering berbicara tentang cuaca, tetapi tanpa urgensi. Musim panas yang cerah terasa seperti blessing setelah bertahun-tahun hardship. Baru saja kota mulai pulih dari Great Plague tahun 1665. Seluruh households pernah disegel di dalam rumah. Streets pernah menjadi sunyi. Orang mati pernah diangkut pada malam hari. Dibandingkan dengan teror itu, musim panas kering terasa hampir ramah. Orang-orang menyambut kehangatan. Mereka membuka windows. Mereka tinggal di luar ruangan lebih lama daripada biasanya. Ketika normal life kembali, ia terasa berharga. Memori tentang plague masih membentuk behavior. Bahkan ketika orang tidak membicarakannya langsung. Banyak families kehilangan relatives. Beberapa neighborhoods lebih sepi dari sebelumnya. Bukan hanya karena houses kosong, tetapi karena habits telah berubah. Orang menghindari close contact ketika bisa. Markets kembali sibuk. Tetapi ada lapisan caution di bawahnya. Churches terisi, meskipun sermons sering membawa reminders tentang human fragility dan divine judgment. Kesadaran yang tertinggal tentang mortality ini secara paradoks menumpulkan fear terhadap bahaya lain. Disease terasa unpredictable dan invisible. Fire, sebaliknya, tampak straightforward dan familiar. Secara politik, England berada dalam periode penyesuaian yang gelisah. Monarki baru dipulihkan 6 tahun sebelumnya setelah Civil War panjang dan eksperimen singkat dalam Republican rule. King Charles II memerintah, tetapi otoritinya berdiri di atas kompromis. Luka lama belum sepenuhnya sembuh. Religious divisions tetap ada. Suspicion terhadap foreigners, terutama Dutch dan French, mendidih di bawah permukaan. England sedang berperang dengan Dutch Republic, dan rumors bergerak cepat melalui taverns serta wharves. London, sebagai pusat trade dan governance, menyerap tensions ini setiap hari. Merchants khawatir tentang shipping losses. Sailors membawa news dari luar negeri, sering exaggerated atau incomplete. Pamphlets beredar bebas, berspekulasi tentang enemies from within and without. Anxiety ada, tetapi tersebar. Ia terbagi ke banyak kekhawatiran. Tidak ada satu thread yang mendominasi perhatian. Fire tidak menjadi bagian dari percakapan itu. Kota fisik mencerminkan campuran confidence dan strain ini. Repairs dari plague year masih berjalan. Beberapa houses sempat abandon lalu dihuni kembali. Yang lain dibersihkan dan ditambal secara terburu-buru. Maintenance tidak merata. Di banyak buildings, beams yang terbuka selama repairs sebelumnya tetap untreated. Sawdust dan shavings dari construction tertinggal di corners. Detail-detail ini penting, walaupun belum ada yang memahami betapa pentingnya. Water levels di Thames berubah mengikuti season. Pada akhir summer, river lebih rendah daripada biasanya. Barges masih memindahkan goods dengan efisien, tetapi access points di sepanjang shore menjadi lebih berlumpur dan kurang nyaman. Wells di beberapa districts menghasilkan lebih sedikit water, meskipun masih cukup untuk daily needs. Sekali lagi, perubahan-perubahan ini tidak terlihat sebagai threats. Kota ini pernah melewati dry spell sebelumnya. Namun, wind patterns mulai bergeser dengan cara yang segera menjadi kritis. Easterly wind menetap di atas region itu. Stabil, bukan tiba-tiba keras. Ia tidak cukup violent untuk menarik perhatian. Ia tidak mengganggu shipping atau merobohkan signs. Ia hanya bergerak hour after hour, menyalurkan udara melalui narrow streets kota. Orang memperhatikan breeze di alleys. Doors yang tertutup lebih kuat dari dugaan. Smoke yang bergerak horizontal daripada naik. Semua itu terasa seperti keanehan kecil, bukan warnings. Rhythm of work terus berjalan tanpa perubahan. Bakers bersiap untuk Sunday yang sibuk. Brewers merebus batches besar untuk memenuhi demand. Candlemakers merender tallow. Semua trades ini bergantung pada heat yang dipertahankan dalam waktu lama. Dalam cuaca dingin, fire sering diawasi lebih hati-hati. Dalam cuaca hangat, fatigue dan rutin sering menumpulkan attention. Ovens ditahan panasnya, bukan dipadamkan sepenuhnya. Ashes direket out, tetapi embers tetap tinggal. Pada malam hari, city bersinar lembut. Candlelight berkelip di balik shutters. Oil lamps menandai taverns dan inns. Sparks kadang keluar dari chimneys, tetapi ini cukup biasa untuk diabaikan kecuali langsung menimbulkan masalah. Watchmen tetap melakukan rounds mereka, memanggil jam. Kehadiran mereka memperkuat sense of order. Seseorang selalu terjaga. Seseorang selalu mengawasi. Namun watch itu dibatasi oleh habit. Watchmen tidak dilatih untuk membayangkan disasters di luar pengalaman mereka. Tugas mereka adalah mencegah theft, mencatat disturbances, dan merespons visible problems. Small fire yang ditemukan lebih awal dapat ditangani. Gagasan tentang fire yang menyebar melampaui beberapa buildings tidak termasuk dalam kerangka pikiran mereka. Past experience tidak mendukungnya. Cultural attitudes memperkuat fokus sempit ini. Fire sering dilihat sebagai moral events, sama seperti physical events. Sermons membingkainya sebagai warnings atau punishments, tetapi jarang sebagai systemic failures. Jika sebuah house terbakar, seseorang pasti ceroboh atau berdosa. Framing individual seperti ini menghambat pemikiran lebih luas tentang infrastructure atau prevention. Responsibility bersifat personal, bukan kolektif. Musim panas itu juga membawa symbolic weight. Tahun 1666 sendiri telah menimbulkan unies bagi sebagian Londoners. Numbers memiliki makna, terutama dalam society yang sangat religius. Pengulangan digit 6 mengingatkan beberapa preachers dan pamphleteers pada apocalyptic imagery dari scripture. Gagasan-gagasan ini beredar di margins, dibicarakan diam-diam atau langsung dismissed. Sebagian besar orang tidak terlalu lama memikirkannya. Hidup sehari-hari menuntut perhatian pada urusan yang lebih dekat, lebih nyata, dan lebih mendesak. Pasar-pasar ramai pada akhir Agustus. Gandum datang dari pedesaan. Daging diasinkan dan disimpan. Wool dan cloth bergerak terus melalui warehouses. Kota itu terasa makmur kembali, setidaknya di permukaan. Namun kemakmuran itu meningkatkan risiko dengan cara yang tidak langsung terlihat. Lebih banyak barang berarti lebih banyak ruang penyimpanan. Lebih banyak ruang penyimpanan berarti lebih banyak bangunan dipenuhi muatan. Lebih banyak kekayaan berarti lebih besar keraguan untuk menghancurkan properti. Bahkan ketika properti itu mungkin perlu dikorbankan demi menyelamatkan kota. Bahkan dalam keadaan yang kelak akan menjadi darurat, city government masih menjalankan urusan rutinnya. Records tetap disimpan. Taxes tetap dikumpulkan. Disputes kecil tetap diselesaikan. Tidak ada rasa bahwa sebuah krisis besar sedang mendekat. Officials percaya pada procedures yang sudah mapan. Extraordinary measures membutuhkan extraordinary justification, dan pada saat itu, belum ada sesuatu pun yang tampak cukup kuat untuk membenarkan alarm. Families bersiap menghadapi autumn. Clothing diperbaiki. Supplies dihitung. Children kembali ke apprenticeship setelah jeda musim panas. Masa depan terasa terbentang dalam garis-garis yang familiar. Orang merencanakan weeks ahead, bukan hours ahead. Cara berpikir seperti ini membentuk perception mereka. Fire memang dapat datang tiba-tiba, tetapi planning harian mengasumsikan stability. Di pinggir kota, fields mulai kering. Farmers diam-diam khawatir tentang harvest yields, tetapi food supplies masih dianggap cukup. Countryside belum merasa terancam. Masalah London terasa sebagai masalah London sendiri. Rural life dan urban life memang saling bertemu melalui trade, tetapi risk tidak bergerak semudah itu dalam imajinasi. Semua faktor ini menciptakan calm yang aneh. Bukan peace sepenuhnya, tetapi perasaan bahwa tidak ada sesuatu yang benar-benar baru akan terjadi. Kota itu sudah cukup terguncang oleh plague, war, dan uncertainty. Kota itu merasa pantas beristirahat. Keyakinan yang tidak diucapkan ini menurunkan vigilance. Pemahaman ilmiah tentang fire pada masa itu juga terbatas. Orang tahu api membutuhkan fuel dan air, tetapi konsep seperti radiant heat, ember travel, dan firestorm belum menjadi pengetahuan umum. Gagasan bahwa fire dapat menciptakan windnya sendiri, menarik udara ke dalam dirinya, lalu memperkuat penyebarannya, adalah vocabulary masa depan. Pada tahun 1666, fire dipahami secara linear, bukan eksponensial. Ia bergerak dari satu objek ke objek berikutnya. Hentikan di sini, maka ia akan berhenti di tempat lain. Kesalahpahaman ini sangat penting. Ia memengaruhi seberapa cepat orang merespons early signs, seberapa serius mereka membaca perubahan perilaku api, dan seberapa bersedia mereka mengorbankan properti demi containment. Summer conditions telah mengubah behavior fire, tetapi understanding manusia tertinggal di belakang reality. Ketika Agustus berakhir dan September mendekat, kota itu tetap seimbang di atas habit. Dryness makin dalam, wind terus bertahan, work berjalan, sleep datang dengan mudah. Tidak ada sesuatu dalam daily life yang menunjukkan bahwa semua elemen ini sedang bergerak menuju katastrofe. Malam Sabtu, 1 September, tidak membawa bobot khusus. Taverns tutup seperti biasa. Families beristirahat. Bakers bersiap untuk Sunday. Kota menghembuskan napas ke dalam darkness. Tidak sadar bahwa kondisi-kondisi ordinary dari summer itu telah mempersiapkan London bukan hanya untuk sebuah fire, tetapi untuk fire yang akan bertindak dengan cara yang belum pernah dilihat siapapun. Ketika flames pertama muncul, mereka tidak datang sebagai gangguan terhadap calm. Mereka datang sebagai kelanjutan dari calm itu. Restless Summer telah melakukan pekerjaannya. Kota itu hanya belum menyadarinya. Api kecil di Pudding Lane. Pada jam-jam sangat awal hari Minggu, 2 September, ketika London berada pada titik paling sunyi, sebuah fire kecil muncul di Pudding Lane. Api itu dimulai dengan cara yang akan terlihat biasa saja seandainya ditemukan tepat waktu. Di Pudding Lane, sebuah narrow street yang turun menuju Thames, berdiri bakery milik Thomas Fariner, baker bagi King. Bangunan itu khas untuk London lama. Timber frame, tinggi, sempit, dan rapat dengan tetangganya. Bakery menempati lower floors. Di atasnya terdapat living quarters tempat family tidur. Seperti banyak buildings lain di kota itu, rumah ini menggabungkan work dan home dalam satu vertical space. Baking dilakukan pada malam hari. Ovens besar dan dirancang untuk menahan heat selama berjam-jam. Setelah dinyalakan, oven dapat memanggang batch demi batch tanpa perlu dinyalakan ulang. Pada akhir pekerjaan, fire biasanya di-racket out, embers dikurangi, dan oven dibiarkan cool slowly. Ini adalah standar practice, diulang night after night di seluruh city. Ia bergantung pada experience, bukan instruments. Bakers menilai heat dengan feeling, dengan color, dan dengan habit. Pada suatu saat setelah midnight, sesuatu berjalan salah. Exact momennya tidak dapat diketahui dengan pasti. Yang jelas, embers masih cukup panas untuk ignite material di dekatnya. Mungkin spark keluar dari oven, mungkin ash dibuang secara tidak hati-hati, mungkin heat berpindah melalui brick ke surrounding timber. Apapun detailnya, hasilnya sama. Fire masuk ke struktur bangunan itu sendiri. Pada awalnya, api itu mungkin kecil, lebih seperti smolder daripada blaze. Timber tidak selalu langsung menyala terang. Ia menghitam, menghangat, melemah, lalu baru terbakar penuh. Awal yang lambat inilah yang membuat fire begitu berbahaya. Ia memberi flames waktu untuk tumbuh tanpa terlihat, feeding quietly on dry wood, pitch, dan stored materials. Keluarga Fariner sedang tidur. Begitu juga sebagian besar neighbors. Street di luar gelap dan still. Watchmen lewat pada interval tertentu, tetapi kecuali flames atau smoke sudah terlihat, tidak ada yang memancing perhatian. Di dalam building, heat mulai terkumpul. Beams menghangat, air currents terbentuk di dalam vertical shaft rumah, menarik fresh oxygen ke atas. Begitu fire benar-benar terbentuk, ia menciptakan movementnya sendiri. Struktur bangunan membantu proses itu. Ketika fire akhirnya terlihat keluar dari bakery, kekuatannya sudah jauh lebih besar daripada yang tampak dari luar. Smoke memenuhi lower rooms lebih dulu, lalu naik. Family terbangun karena heat dan choking air. Thomas Fariner, children-nya, dan seorang servant mencoba escape. Mereka bergerak ke atas, bukan ke bawah. sebuah insting umum ketika smoke memblokir exits. Upper floors sudah panas, tetapi roof menawarkan kesempatan. Fariner dan keluarganya berhasil climb out menuju neighboring buildings dan selamat. Namun seorang maid tidak berhasil. Ia menjadi known fatality pertama dari Great Fire, terjebak oleh smoke dan flame sebelum help dapat datang. Di luar, flames mulai muncul melalui windows dan roof timbers. Fire yang kini terlihat akhirnya menarik perhatian. Neighbors berteriak memberi alarm. Seruan fire menggema turun ke lane. Orang-orang bangun dari beds mereka, menarik clothes, mengambil buckets. Watch diberitahu. Bells mulai berbunyi. Semua ini terjadi dalam minutes. Tetapi minutes mattered. Initial responses mengikuti patterns yang sudah familiar. Buckets diisi dan dioper hand-to-hand dari pumps terdekat atau dari river. Water dilemparkan ke burning building. Hooks digunakan untuk mencoba pull down bagian structure, tetapi fire sudah memiliki foothold di dalam house. Water dari luar tidak mudah mencapai heart of the blaze. Kesempitan pudding lane membatasi movement. Heat memaksa orang mundur. Wind yang stabil dari east mulai memainkan perannya. Ia mendorong flames ke west, lebih dalam ke city. Sparks terangkat dan jatuh ke neighboring roofs. Roofs itu kering, sering dilapisi pitch, dan cepat catch. Apa yang semula satu burning building menjadi dua, lalu tiga. Local officials dipanggil, Alderman of the Ward diberitahu, kabar dikirim kepada Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth. Pada tahap awal ini, fire masih tampak containable. Fires pernah dimulai di bakery sebelumnya. Fire seperti itu pernah dipadamkan. Assumption bahwa fire ini juga dapat manage membentuk decisions yang kemudian diambil. Metode paling efektif untuk menghentikan fire di dense city adalah demolition. Pulling down houses di depan flames dapat menciptakan gaps yang tidak mudah diseberangi api. Tetapi tindakan ini membutuhkan decisiveness dan authority. Artinya menghancurkan properti yang belum terbakar. Owners sering menolak. Officials ragu, menimbang, responsibility dan blame. Ketika Lord Mayor tiba, accounts menunjukkan bahwa ia underestimated danger. Fire aktif, tetapi belum overwhelming. Bloodworth dilaporkan menyatakan confidence bahwa api itu dapat ditangani. Apakah kalimat persisnya benar atau tidak sepenting mindset yang tampak di baliknya. Fire dilihat sebagai insiden, bukan turning point. Permission untuk demolish nearby houses ditunda. Beberapa minor efforts dilakukan, tetapi tidak pada scale yang diperlukan. Akibatnya, fire terus menyebar melalui adjacent buildings. Setiap structure baru menambah fuel. Setiap collapse mengirim showers of sparks keluar. Geografi Pudding Lane memperbesar problem. Street itu slope down toward the river, memungkinkan wind menyalurkan flames sepanjang jalurnya. Buildings leaned inward, trapping heat. Fire climbed walls dan leapt across gaps dengan mudah. Water access terbatas. River dekat, tetapi moving water uphill into the blaze lambat dan exhausting. Ketika dawn mendekat, fire menjadi lebih terang. Smoke menebal, rising into morning air. Sky di atas Eastern City mulai glow. Cahaya tidak wajar yang dapat dilihat dari jauh. Orang yang bangun di bagian London lain mencium smell lebih dulu, lalu melihatnya. Dari kejauhan, fire itu masih belum tampak katastrofik. Fires bukan pemandangan aneh di skyline London. Tetapi yang satu ini lebih besar, lebih persisten, dan tidak cepat melemah. Efforts untuk contain blaze terus berjalan, tetapi coordination buruk. Paris boundaries mempersulit response. Equipment berbeda-beda kualitasnya. Beberapa fire engines tiba, tetapi reach-nya terbatas. Heat membengkokkan wooden pump components. Hoses, jika tersedia, terlalu pendek. Water evaporated before it could do much good. Behavior fire mulai berubah saat ia tumbuh. Heat menghasilkan strong updrafts. Fresh air ditarik masuk di ground level, feeding the flames. Efek ini memperkuat fire, bukan memadamkannya. Sparks bergerak lebih jauh. Roofs ignited without direct contact. Fire tidak lagi membutuhkan continuous line of fuel. Ia dapat jump. Panik belum sepenuhnya muncul, tetapi concern menyebar. Merchants dekat river mulai memindahkan goods sebagai precaution. Families yang lebih dekat dengan fire mengumpulkan belongings. Carts mungkul di streets. Trafik meningkat. Jalan sempit yang sejak awal sudah crowded menjadi lebih sulit dinavigasi. Namun masih ada hesitation untuk menyatakan emergency. City tidak memiliki formal mechanism untuk declaration semacam itu. Respons bergantung pada individual judgment. Banyak yang berharap fire akan slow ketika mencapai larger stone buildings atau open spaces. Yang lain berharap wind berubah. Hope mengisi celah yang ditinggalkan uncertainty. Ketika morning fully broke, fire menyeberangi Thames Street, igniting warehouses yang penuh oil, spirits, dan combustible goods. Ini adalah critical escalation. Material sini burned hotter dan faster daripada ordinary household contents. Explosions mengirim debris ke air. Riverfront, yang tadinya dianggap potensial resource, berubah menjadi source of fuel. Dari titik ini, fire tidak lagi confined to a single street or trade. Ia telah mencapai komersial heart kota. Smoke menyebar luas. Ash mulai jatuh di neighborhoods bermil-mil jauhnya. Smell of burning memenuhi air. Initial failure untuk menghentikan fire di Pudding Lane kelak akan scrutinize in detail. Orang akan bertanya mengapa houses tidak pull down sooner, mengapa authority hesitated, mengapa warnings tidak heeded. Pada saat itu pertanyaan-pertanyaan ini belum ada. Mereka yang terlibat bertindak dalam limits of their experience. Small fire yang dimulai di Fariner's Bakery bukan small karena ia tidak memiliki power. Ia small karena dimulai quietly. Early stagesnya menawarkan narrow window for control. Sebuah jendela yang tertutup sangat cepat ketika conditions align against the city. Pada mid-morning, window itu sudah gone. Fire bergerak westward, driven by wind and fuel, meninggalkan trail of collapsed buildings dan glowing embers. Pudding Lane, point of origin, sudah unrecognizable. Apa yang tadinya working street berisi shops dan homes menjadi line of smoking ruins. Bagi city secara keseluruhan, ini masih hanya beginning. Fire telah memperlihatkan seberapa cepat ordinary life dapat overturned. Ia telah exposing weaknesses dalam response dan understanding. Tetapi London belum benar-benar grasp scale dari apa yang akan datang. Spark di Pudding Lane tidak announce itself as history. Ia behaved like many small fires before it. Sampai ia tidak lagi begitu. Dan dalam perbedaan itulah fate of the city berada. Kebingungan saat fajar. Ketika daylight menyebar di London pada morning of Sunday, September 2nd, fire memasuki phase baru yang lebih dangerous. Bukan karena tiba-tiba menjadi lebih violent, tetapi karena ia menjadi lebih visible. Dan visibility membawa confusion, bukan clarity. Dari rooftops dan upper windows across the city, column of smoke terlihat naik dari eastern districts. Smoke itu menggelapkan pale morning sky dan drifted westward, carried by the same steady wind yang telah feeding flames through the night. Bagi banyak Londoners, inilah first moment mereka sadar bahwa sesuatu yang unusual sedang terjadi. District level, city walk unevenly. Di areas yang jauh dari Pudding Lane, shops open seperti biasa pada Sunday morning. Church bells memanggil parishioners ke early services. Bakers elsewhere delivered bread. Carts rolled melalui narrow streets. Rhythms of ordinary life tetap berjalan. Bahkan ketika smoke thickened in the air, orang mencium smell, sharp dan persistent, tetapi smell saja belum menandakan katastrofe. London often smelled of smoke. Hearths, forges, dan kilns memastikan itu. Namun closer to the fire, situation deteriorated quickly. Thames Street, densely packed dengan warehouses dan wharves, kini fully involved. Barrels of oil, pitch, dan spirits burned intensely. Flames rolled along the riverfront, licking at wooden piers dan sending heat shimmering across the water. Attempts to fight fire from boats proved dangerous and largely ineffective. Sparks leapt from building to building, carried farther by rising heat and wind. Fire tidak lagi advance hanya along streets. It jumped across them. Officials yang arrived on the scene struggled to assess what they were seeing. Fires biasanya evaluated by size and location. Yang ini defied easy measurement. Ia spread in multiple directions at once. Some streets appeared safe, while others collapsed into flame within minutes. Smoke obscured sightlines. Noise made communication difficult. Orders, ketika given, sharing misunderstood atau delayed. Sir Thomas Bloodworth, the Lord Mayor, tetap responsible untuk authorizing large-scale demolitions. Autoritinya clear in theory, tetapi constrained in practice. Destroying houses berarti immediate economic loss dan certainty of anger dari property owners. Compensation mechanisms unclear. Past incidents telah mengajari officials untuk cautious. At dawn, with the fire still spreading but not yet visibly uncontrollable, caution prevailed. Reports circulated bahwa fire mungkin burn itself out once it consumed available fuel. Others suggested it would slow ketika mencapai stone buildings atau open spaces. Ideas ini reflected past experience, not current conditions. Warehouses along Thames Street ensured continuous supply of combustible material. Narrow lanes acted as channels for wind. Stone walls cracked and failed under sustained heat, allowing fire to pass through rather than stop. Firefighting efforts intensified tetapi remained fragmented. Parish engines deployed where possible. Buckets moved constantly, meskipun fatigue sempat set in. Water sources became congested. People waited their turn at pumps while flames advanced elsewhere. Coordination across parishes minimal. Each group focused on immediate surroundings, unaware or unable to respond to developments beyond their line of sight. As morning progressed, traffic increased. Residents dari threatened areas began to move belongings preemptively. Carts appeared loaded with furniture, bedding, tools, done goods. Streets clogged. Movement slowed. Fire engines struggled to get through. In some cases, people abandoned firefighting to save their own property. Ini bukan sekadar selfishness. Ini rational response terhadap uncertainty. Without clear direction, individuals acted for their families first. Rumors spread faster than reliable information. Some claimed the fire had already reached St. Paul's Cathedral. Others said it had been deliberately set. Whispers of foreign agents circulated, fueled by wartime fears. None of these rumors were accurate at this stage, but they shaped behavior. Suspicion grew. Cooperation weakened. Authority Lord Mayor continued to erode as scale of the problem became clearer. Requests for permission to demolish buildings increased. Each delay allowed the fire to gain ground. In some instances, residents took matters into their own hands, pulling down small structures without official sanction. Efforts ini inconsistent dan often too limited to matter. By mid-morning, fire had spread beyond original parish. It moved westward along Thames Street and began to push northward into city proper. Ini marked psychological shift. Fires along riverfront were serious, but often contained. Fire advancing inland threatened commercial and civic heart of London. Danger now extended beyond warehouses to homes, churches, and markets. King Charles II was informed of the situation as reports reached Whitehall. At first, information incomplete and contradictory. Distances underestimated. Speeds misjudged. Advisors struggled to convey urgency without overstatement. King, experienced enough to recognize potential for disaster, began to take more direct interest. However, City of London retained formal control over its own affairs. Royal intervention required careful navigation of jurisdiction. Within the city, confusion deepened. Some officials ordered evacuations. Others advised people to stay put. Bells rang in some parishes and not in others. Smoke reduced visibility to such an extent that orientation became difficult. Streets once familiar now felt altered. People took wrong turns. Carts overturned. Horses panicked at the heat and noise. Fire itself behaved unpredictably. In some places, it paused, consuming a cluster of buildings before advancing. In others, it surged ahead, igniting roofs seemingly at random. This irregularity made planning difficult. Fire breaks created in one area proved useless when fire bypassed them entirely by leaping through the air. Emotional responses varied. Some Londoners acted with remarkable calm, methodically moving goods and assisting neighbors. Others froze, overwhelmed by scale of destruction. Absence of a single authoritative voice contributed to this range of reactions. No one could say with confidence what would happen next. Churches, traditionally places of refuge, filled quickly. People brought valuables and sought shelter, assuming thick walls would provide safety. Clergy struggled to manage crowds. Some churches attempted to protect nearby buildings by focusing firefighting efforts there, while others prepared for possible evacuation. Economic concerns complicated decision-making. Merchants hesitated to abandon warehouses filled with valuable stock. Insurance, as a concept, was limited and inconsistent. Losses would be personal and immediate. This hesitation kept people in danger longer than was wise and delayed broader retreat. As the sun climbed higher, fire showed no sign of slowing. Instead, it grew brighter and louder. The roar of burning intensified. Heat could be felt at greater distances. Ash fell steadily, settling on clothing and hair. The sky darkened despite daylight, creating an eerie, muted atmosphere. By late morning, it became clear to many that traditional methods were failing. Yet, acknowledgement did not immediately translate into effective action. Authority remained divided. Resources were stretched thin. Experience offered no guide for a fire of this size and behavior. Confusion at dawn was not simply a failure of leadership or courage. It was the collision of old assumptions with new reality. London's systems had been designed for familiar problems. This fire was not familiar. It moved faster, burned hotter, and spread farther than anything in living memory. As the city struggled to adjust, valuable hours slipped away. Each delay allowed the fire to entrench itself more deeply. By the time decisive measures were finally considered, the opportunity for easy containment had passed. The morning of September 2nd ended not with resolution, but with the growing realization that London faced something unprecedented. The city had awakened to a crisis it did not yet understand, and confusion, more than flame alone, would shape the course of the next terrible days. Api bertemu angin. By the afternoon of Sunday, the fire and the wind had fully discovered each other. Once they did, the character of the disaster changed again. What had begun as a spreading blaze now behaved as a moving force, shaped less by human effort than by weather and structure. The easterly wind, steady since the night before, did not weaken as day wore on. Instead, it pressed consistently into the burning districts, feeding oxygen into the flames and pushing heat westward through the dense fabric of the city. Wind mattered not only for its strength, but for its direction. From the east, it drove the fire directly toward the heart of London. Streets that ran roughly east to west became channels. Flames advanced along them with alarming speed while sparks lifted high and landed far ahead of the visible fire line. This behavior confused observers. Fires were expected to spread from building to building, not appear suddenly on distant rooftops. Yet, that is exactly what happened. Roofs ignited without warning. A house that seemed safe moments earlier could burst into flame as embers settled into dry thatch or lodged in cracks between tiles. People attempting to defend their homes found themselves surrounded from multiple sides. Water thrown onto one wall did nothing to stop fire arriving from above. Buckets emptied faster than they could be refilled. The sound of the fire changed as well. Instead of the crackle of burning wood, there was now a constant roar, deep and sustained. It was the sound of many structures burning at once, of air rushing inward and upward, of collapsing timbers and exploding barrels. Conversation became difficult. Shouted orders were lost. Bells rang, but their messages blurred together. Heat intensified across a wide area. People several streets away felt it on their faces. Metal fixtures grew hot to the touch. Windows cracked. Even stone buildings suffered as mortar weakened and walls fractured. Assumption bahwa stone offered complete protection began to fail under these conditions. Fire engines proved increasingly ineffective. Their short range meant operators had to move dangerously close to flames. Leather hoses, where they existed, dried and stiffened in the heat. Water streams evaporated before reaching targets. In some cases, engines themselves caught fire. Crews abandoned them, retreating as flames closed in. Wind also affected smoke behavior. Instead of rising straight upward, smoke was driven low and fast through streets. Visibility dropped sharply. People lost their sense of direction. Familiar landmarks disappeared behind thick, choking clouds. Breathing became difficult, especially for elderly and children. Those who lingered too long near the fire found themselves overwhelmed by smoke rather than flame. As conditions worsened, movement became chaotic. Streets filled with carts, wheelbarrows, and people on foot. Some tried to flee westward, away from the fire's advance, only to find roads blocked or impossible. Others turned north, hoping to escape laterally, but found flames already cutting off routes. The city's layout, once merely inconvenient, now became dangerous. The wind carried burning debris into open spaces that might otherwise have served as refuges. Churchyards, small squares, and market areas caught fire as embers settled among wooden stalls and sheds. These spaces, instead of slowing the fire, became new points of ignition. Fire breaks created earlier lost effectiveness as flames leapt across them. Along the riverfront, situation grew more volatile. Warehouses storing oil, tar, brandy, and other flammable goods burned with intense heat. Barrels burst, sending flaming liquid across streets and into the river itself. For a time, the Thames appeared to burn, its surface dotted with floating fire. Boats attempting rescues or firefighting had to pull back. The river, which many had assumed would act as a natural barrier, failed to contain the fire's influence. While flames did not cross the Thames in the same way they crossed streets, heat and sparks threatened vessels and structures on both banks. Smoke spread far downstream. The sense of safety the river provided was psychological rather than practical. As afternoon progressed, fire reached increasingly prominent areas. Shops, homes, and churches fell in rapid succession. Each collapse added to intensity of the blaze. Falling buildings released stored heat and fuel, creating surges that overwhelmed nearby efforts at control. The behavior of the fire puzzled and frightened observers. It did not respect boundaries or expectations. Attempts to predict its path failed repeatedly. This unpredictability undermined the morale. People accustomed to managing risk through experience found themselves without guidance. Authorities struggled to reassert themselves. Orders were given to widen fire breaks, but execution was slow. Tools were scarce. Laborers were exhausted. Some residents resisted destruction of their homes, clinging to hope that the fire might spare them. Others had already fled, leaving empty structures to burn unchecked. By late afternoon, it was clear that traditional firefighting was no longer the primary means of response. The scale of fire demanded drastic measures. Yet coordination remained difficult. The Lord Mayor's earlier hesitation now carried consequences. With each passing hour, fire's momentum increased. While the city's ability to respond diminished, King Charles II, recognizing severity of the situation, began to take a more active role. Royal messengers moved between Whitehall and city, carrying instructions and reports. The king urged decisive action, including use of gunpowder to demolish buildings ahead of the fire. This advice was sound, but faced practical obstacles. Gunpowder was not readily available in large quantities within the city. Using it required expertise and courage. The wind showed no sign of relenting. Instead, it continued its steady push hour after hour, shaping the fire's advance. Night approached again, bringing new dangers. Darkness would reduce visibility further, while wind and heat remained constant. Fatigue weighed heavily on everyone involved. As evening fell, fire's glow illuminated the sky across much of London. People miles away could see it, a vast shifting light that turned night into dim, flickering day. Ash fell like snow, coating roofs and streets. Smell of burning was everywhere. For those still near the fire, survival became the only goal. Organized response gave way to individual decisions. Families separated in the rush to escape. Possessions were abandoned. The city's social fabric, woven over centuries, began to tear under strain. Fire and wind together created a force greater than either alone. Wind fed the fire, and fire altered the wind, drawing it inward and upward, intensifying its own spread. This feedback loop was not understood at the time, but it was felt. People later spoke of being pushed by hot air, of flames seeming to move with purpose. By the end of Sunday, London was no longer facing fire in the ordinary sense. It faced a moving front of destruction, advancing faster than people could retreat and consuming more than anyone had believed possible. The wind remained its ally. Until that alliance broke, the city had little hope of stopping the flames. The realization settled slowly and unevenly. London was not simply burning. It was being reshaped by fire and air together, and the outcome was no longer under human control. Leadership di bawah tekanan. By the second night of the fire, leadership in London was no longer a matter of titles or formal authority, but of endurance under pressure. The city's governing structures, designed for routine administration and familiar emergencies, now faced a crisis that moved faster than orders could be written and spread wider than jurisdictional boundaries. Decisions that once unfolded over weeks were demanded in minutes. The strain exposed not only individual weaknesses, but systemic limits that had been invisible in calmer times. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, remained the central figure within the City of London's formal response. His office carried legal authority to order demolition of buildings, a power that had become crucial as fire advanced. Yet that authority had been built for restraint, not urgency. Bloodworth was accustomed to balancing competing interests: merchants, property owners, aldermen, and guilds. His role required caution and consensus. In the face of rapidly spreading fire, those instincts became liabilities. Throughout Sunday and into Monday, requests for decisive action multiplied. Aldermen from threatened wards pressed for permission to pull down houses ahead of flames. Firefighters and watchmen reported that narrow streets and closely packed buildings made containment impossible without large fire breaks. Each request placed Bloodworth in the same position: authorize destruction now and face immediate backlash, or delay and hope fire slowed on its own. The weight of responsibility grew heavier as consequences of earlier hesitation became clear. Houses that might have been sacrificed early to save entire districts were now fully involved in the blaze. Economic cost of delay increased with each hour, yet political cost of action also grew. The more widespread fire became, the more property owners were affected, and the louder their objections. Bloodworth's personal endurance was also tested. Accounts from the time describe him as overwhelmed and exhausted, moving through smoke-filled streets, confronted by desperate residents and conflicting reports. Whether he truly uttered dismissive remarks about fire being easily put out matters less than the broader truth. He did not fully grasp scale of disaster until it had already exceeded his ability to manage it. Leadership failure in this context was not simply individual. City of London had no standing emergency council capable of overriding normal procedures. Authority was fragmented among parishes, wards, and guilds. Communication relied on messengers moving through crowded, smoke-filled streets. There were no centralized maps, no real-time reports, no way to see the whole city at once. Each decision was made with partial information. As fire spread westward, it moved beyond areas most familiar to city officials. New neighborhoods with different layouts and populations came under threat. Some officials focused on protecting symbolic landmarks or economically vital areas, while others prioritized residential districts. Without unified strategy, efforts pulled in different directions. The strain of leadership was visible in how orders were given and received. Instructions to demolish buildings were sometimes vague, specifying general areas rather than exact structures. Those tasked with carrying them out hesitated, unsure which houses to pull down and how far to go. In some cases, demolition began only to be halted by protests from owners or counter-orders from other officials. This inconsistency reduced effectiveness of fire breaks. Fear of blame loomed large. Officials understood that decisions made under pressure would be judged later once crisis passed. Destroying private property without clear legal protection risked lawsuits, political retaliation, and damage to reputation. This fear encouraged delay, even when delay clearly worsened the situation. Arrival of royal attention altered the balance slightly. King Charles II and his brother James, Duke of York, recognized danger sooner than many city officials. From Whitehall, they received increasingly alarming reports. The glow of fire was visible from royal residence. Smoke drifted across Thames. Scale of blaze could no longer be minimized. James, who would later become King James II, took an active role on the ground. He moved among firefighting efforts, issuing instructions and encouraging use of gunpowder to create fire breaks. His presence lent authority to actions that might otherwise have been contested. Royal backing reduced some resistance from property owners, though it did not eliminate practical difficulties. The king himself issued orders urging decisive demolition. However, royal authority within City of London was not absolute. The city guarded its privileges carefully. Cooperation required negotiation as much as command. In midst of advancing fire, this constitutional complexity slowed response. Leadership strain was also evident among lower-level officials. Paris officers, watchmen, and constables faced impossible choices. They were responsible for maintaining order, yet order itself was dissolving. Evacuations were chaotic. Theft increased as abandoned houses stood open. Accusations flew, particularly against foreigners and outsiders. Maintaining calm became as difficult as stopping fire. Some leaders rose to the occasion despite these challenges. Individuals took initiative where formal structures failed. Groups of men organized ad hoc demolition teams. Others coordinated bucket lines across parish boundaries. Clergy opened churches for shelter and storage despite risks. These efforts were courageous, but limited in scope. They could not substitute for coordinated citywide strategy. Fatigue compounded every problem. Leadership required constant presence, but sleep was scarce. Smoke irritated eyes and lungs. Heat drained strength. Decision-making suffered as exhaustion set in. Errors multiplied. Orders contradicted one another. People forgot details or misunderstood instructions. The psychological toll was significant. Leaders were confronted daily with loss and fear, not as abstract concepts, but as faces and voices. Residents begged for permission to save their homes. Others demanded action to protect livelihoods. Some accused officials of favoritism or incompetence. Each encounter added pressure. As Monday wore on, fire continued to advance, and leadership structures continued to fray. Bloodworth's capacity to direct events diminished. At some point, he reportedly withdrew physically and effectively, leaving others to act. Whether through illness, exhaustion, or despair, his absence created a vacuum. Into that vacuum stepped royal authority more decisively. James and other nobles took on greater responsibility for directing demolitions and coordinating efforts. Military resources, including trained men and access to gunpowder, were brought into play. These actions came late, but marked a turning point in how response was organized. Contrast between early hesitation and later decisiveness would become a central theme in accounts of the fire. Critics would argue that stronger leadership at the outset could have saved much of the city. Defenders would point to unprecedented nature of disaster and constraints under which officials operated. Both views contained truth. Leadership under strain revealed limits of governance built for stability rather than crisis. London's leaders were not uniquely flawed. They were products of a system that assumed emergencies would resemble the past. When reality diverged sharply from experience, adaptation was slow. By the end of the second day, it was clear that authority alone could not stop the fire. Leadership now focused on mitigation rather than prevention. Slowing spread, protecting key areas, and preparing for aftermath. This shift marked sobering acceptance of loss. Fire continued to burn, but nature of leadership began to change. Responsibility spread outward, shared among royal figures, local officials, and ordinary citizens acting beyond formal roles. The city's survival would depend less on individual leaders and more on collective endurance. In this crucible, leadership was stripped of ceremony and reduced to action under pressure. Titles mattered less than decisions. Tradition mattered less than speed. Great Fire forced London to confront not only physical vulnerability, but fragility of systems meant to protect it. King Dan Court may respond. As fire tightened its grip on London, distance between royal court and burning city collapsed. What had begun as civic emergency became national one, not through proclamation, but through sight and proximity. From Whitehall, King Charles II could see smoke rising in a vast shifting column. By night, sky glowed to the east, a restless light that refused to dim. Reports arriving at court grew more urgent, less orderly, and more troubling with each hour. It was no longer possible to treat fire as a local problem to be managed by city officials alone. The king's court itself was shaped by recent upheaval. Charles II had returned to throne only 6 years earlier after long exile and civil war. His authority rested on careful balance between crown and parliament, between royal prerogative and civic independence. City of London was especially protective of its privileges. Intervention had to be handled delicately, even in crisis. Yet scale of fire forced reconsideration of these boundaries. Charles II was not a distant monarch. He was practical, observant, and more experienced in adversity than his reputation for leisure might suggest. He had seen cities damaged by war. He understood logistics, movement, and value of decisive action. As fire spread beyond Thames Street and into core of city, he recognized that hesitation would only deepen loss. Duke of York, James, his brother and heir, shared this assessment and acted even more directly. James took an active, visible role, moving into city to oversee firefighting and demolition efforts. His presence mattered. Royal authority embodied in a figure on the ground cut through disputes that had stalled local decision-making. Where city officials hesitated, royal orders carried weight. At court, discussions shifted rapidly from observation to response. Advisors debated how far royal authority could and should extend. There was concern about precedent. Overriding city governance could provoke resentment or political backlash later, but fire did not pause for constitutional reflection. Each hour of debate translated into more buildings lost. Charles II issued instructions urging aggressive use of fire breaks, including demolition of houses ahead of flames. Gunpowder, stored in limited quantities within the city, was identified as the most effective means to achieve this quickly. Orders were sent to secure supplies from Tower of London and other military stores. Trained personnel were dispatched to handle explosives safely. This marked shift from civilian to quasi-military response. Soldiers accustomed to discipline and rapid execution of orders were better suited to coordinated demolition than ad hoc civilian groups. Their involvement reassured some residents that action was being taken at highest level, though it alarmed others who feared uncontrolled destruction. The court also confronted human dimension of disaster. Reports described families fleeing with what they could carry, crowds gathering in open fields, and churches filling beyond capacity. Charles II authorized relief measures where possible, instructing officials to provide food and temporary shelter to those displaced. These measures were limited by logistics and speed, but they signaled royal concern. Communication between court and city remained imperfect. Messengers struggled to move through congested streets. Smoke obscured landmarks. Reports arrived late or incomplete. Decisions were made with imperfect information. Still, presence of a central coordinating authority began to impose some order on chaos. James's role on the ground became especially significant. He coordinated demolition teams, supervised use of gunpowder, and encouraged cooperation across parishes. His actions were pragmatic rather than ceremonial. He listened to reports from firefighters and laborers, adjusted plans, and pressed forward despite resistance. This hands-on leadership contrasted sharply with earlier indecision. Royal involvement also helped address one of the most paralyzing obstacles: fear of blame. Property owners were more willing to accept destruction of their buildings when orders came directly from Crown. Anger and grief remained, but responsibility was no longer diffuse. Decisions carried weight of national authority. The king's engagement extended beyond immediate firefighting. He began considering aftermath, even as fire burned. Advisors discussed how city might be rebuilt, how order might be maintained once flames subsided, and how to prevent similar disasters in future. These conversations did not yet produce concrete plans, but they reflected understanding that fire marked a turning point. At court, religious interpretations of fire circulated alongside practical concerns. Some saw it as divine judgment, others as natural disaster exacerbated by human error. Charles II, though a man of faith, tended toward practical explanations. He did not frame fire as moral spectacle, but as problem to be solved. This outlook influenced tone of royal response. The court also had to manage public perception. Rumors of arson and foreign sabotage spread rapidly. In a city already anxious about war with Dutch, these rumors threatened violence against perceived outsiders. Charles II issued proclamations urging calm and discouraging attacks on foreigners. Maintaining order was as important as stopping fire. As Monday night turned into Tuesday, effectiveness of royal intervention began to show. Large-scale demolitions, coordinated and decisive, created wider fire breaks than earlier efforts. In some areas, fire slowed or stopped entirely when it reached these gaps. Wind continued to drive flames elsewhere, but momentum was no longer entirely one-sided. The court's response was not flawless. Supplies were limited. Coordination took time. Some orders arrived too late to save key districts. Yet contrast with earlier stages was clear. Where leadership had been hesitant, it was now assertive. Where authority had been fragmented, it was increasingly centralized. This shift also altered psychological landscape. People began to believe fire could be contained even if much had already been lost. Hope returned cautiously, not as optimism, but as possibility of an end. This belief mattered. It encouraged continued effort, reduced panic, and restored a measure of cooperation. Royal involvement did not erase tensions between city and crown, but it reframed them. In crisis, boundaries blurred. Fire forced a temporary unity of purpose that peacetime politics often undermined. This unity would not last indefinitely, but in these days, it proved essential. Charles II's personal engagement would later shape how fire was remembered. Accounts emphasized his presence, concern, and decisiveness. Whether these accounts were embellished matters less than the role they played in restoring confidence. A monarch seen to act in disaster reinforced legitimacy of restored monarchy itself. Court response also highlighted limits of centralized power. Even with royal authority, fire could not be commanded at will. Weather, structure, and chance still ruled. Crown could influence outcomes, but not dictate them. This recognition tempered expectations and guided strategy toward containment rather than total control. By the time fire began to lose strength, court was fully engaged, not only in response, but in preparing governance after disaster. Plans for relief, rebuilding, and inquiry took shape even as smoke lingered. King understood that how crown acted next would shape loyalty and memory for generations. In stepping into crisis, court altered trajectory of disaster and relationship between ruler and city. Great Fire became not just a test of urban resilience, but of monarchy itself. Response of king and court did not prevent devastation, but it helped transform chaos into recovery. As flames continued to burn, presence of royal authority provided structure amid destruction. It marked a moment when fire ceased to be solely London's burden and became national concern. That shift would have lasting consequences, both for city and kingdom that claimed it as its heart. Orang London biasa mengungsi. By the time fire had entered its third full day, it was no longer leadership, weather, or strategy that defined the experience of Great Fire for most people. It was movement. London itself seemed to be on the move, flowing outward from center like water spilling from a broken vessel. Fire advanced, but ahead of it traveled fear, urgency, and exhaustion, carried by tens of thousands of ordinary Londoners doing what they had never imagined they would need to do, abandoning their city. For many, decision to flee did not come suddenly. It arrived in stages shaped by denial, hope, and stubborn desire to believe that one's own street would somehow be spared. People listened for news, watched sky, and judged distance by instinct rather than measurement. Smoke alone was not always enough to prompt flight. Flames had to be visible. Heat had to be felt. Only then did hesitation give way to action. Families packed what they could carry. This act revealed priorities more clearly than any speech could. Some chose bedding first, knowing sleep would be needed wherever they ended up. Others reached for tools, trade goods, or account books, hoping to preserve livelihood. Clothing was bundled hastily. Food was taken when possible, though few thought far enough ahead to pack much of it. Valuables small enough to carry were hidden in pockets or tied into bundles. Large items were loaded onto carts if carts could be found. The streets filled quickly. What had once been busy thoroughfares became slow-moving lines of people, animals, and vehicles. Carts creaked under weight of furniture. Horses strained. Oxen moved patiently through smoke and ash. Children walked beside adults or were carried when fatigue overtook them. Elderly relatives were helped along as best as possible. In many cases, families separated unintentionally, losing sight of one another in the crowd. The city's narrow streets, never designed for mass evacuation, became obstacles. Bottlenecks formed where roads narrowed or where fallen debris blocked passage. Some people turned back only to find alternative routes equally congested. Fire engines, demolition crews, and royal messengers all competed for same limited space. Progress slowed to a crawl. Emotional strain mounted as movement became more difficult. People argued over right of way. Tempers flared. Accusations flew. Yet alongside this tension were countless small acts of cooperation. Neighbors helped lift loads. Strangers shared information about safer routes. Children were passed hand to hand across obstacles. Crisis exposed both friction and solidarity. Not everyone fled immediately. Some remained behind, guarding homes or shops as long as possible. Merchants stood watch over warehouses until flames were visible at their doors. Craftsmen hoped to save tools essential to their trade. Clergy attempted to protect churches or move sacred objects. These choices were not irrational. For many, leaving meant total loss. Staying offered at least chance of preservation. As fire spread, staying became increasingly dangerous. Smoke reduced visibility. Falling embers burned skin and clothing. Roofs collapsed without warning. Roar of fire drowned out cries for help. Those who delayed too long sometimes found escape routes cut off. Panic replaced calculation. Movement outward took many directions. Some fled west toward Westminster and beyond. Others went north toward fields and villages outside city walls. Many crossed Thames to South Bank, assuming river would offer safety. Bridges became critical choke points. London Bridge, already lined with buildings, was especially dangerous, though it did not burn during this phase. Still, crossing took time, and crowds pressed forward anxiously. Open spaces outside city filled rapidly. Fields, commons, and hills became temporary refuges. People camped where they could, laying out blankets or bedding salvaged from homes. Carts formed makeshift shelters. The displaced clustered by parish when possible, seeking familiar faces and shared support. The city's social geography reassembled itself in exile. These camps were not orderly. Supplies were scarce. Food had to be purchased or begged for. Water sources were limited. Sanitation was poor. Yet compared to inferno behind them, these hardships felt manageable. Priority was distance from fire, not comfort. Psychological experience of displacement varied widely. Some people felt numb, moving automatically, without fully processing what they were leaving behind. Others were visibly distressed, weeping openly as they watched smoke rise from neighborhoods they might never see again. For many, realization that their homes were likely gone arrived slowly, delayed by sheer effort of escape. Children experienced fire differently. Some were frightened by noise and confusion. Others treated journey as an adventure, at least at first, until fatigue and hunger set in. Parents struggled to maintain calm, knowing their own fear could spread quickly. Animals added another layer of complexity. Horses and oxen were essential for moving goods, but they were also vulnerable to panic. Smoke irritated their eyes and lungs. Smell of fire unsettled them. Keeping animals moving and under control required constant attention. When animals bolted, they caused accidents and injuries. Looting became a concern as neighborhoods emptied. Abandoned houses stood open, their contents visible and tempting. Some theft occurred, though extent was later exaggerated. Most people were too focused on survival to steal. Still, fear of looting kept some residents behind longer than was wise, guarding what little they could. Rumors flourished among fleeing crowds. Stories spread of entire districts destroyed, of fire reaching places it had not yet touched, of enemies setting new blazes ahead of main front. These rumors increased anxiety and sometimes redirected movement unnecessarily. Without reliable information, imagination filled gaps. Act of choosing what to take revealed deep social inequalities. Wealthier residents could afford carts, animals, and hired help. They moved larger quantities of goods and often traveled farther. Poorer Londoners carried what they could on their backs. Many owned little beyond clothing and basic tools. For them, loss was swift and total. Apprentices faced particular challenges. Bound to masters whose shops or homes burned, they suddenly found themselves without shelter or employment. Some stayed with masters' families. Others joined crowds of displaced, uncertain of obligations or future. Guild structures provided some support, but not enough for scale of need. Women bore much of practical burden of evacuation. They packed, organized, and cared for children and elderly relatives. In camps, they sought food and water, tended sick, and tried to establish routines. Their labor was essential, but largely invisible in official accounts. Religious responses accompanied flight. Some prayed openly as they moved, interpreting fire as divine judgment or trial. Others focused on practical matters, postponing reflection. Clergy offered comfort where they could, though many were themselves displaced. Churches outside fire zone became centers of relief and organization. Physical environment outside city transformed rapidly. Areas that had been quiet fields now held dense populations. Paths became roads. Temporary markets sprang up as traders followed crowds. Prices rose sharply. Food shortages threatened. Authorities attempted to regulate supplies, but enforcement was difficult. As night fell on successive days, glow of fire dominated horizon. For those camped outside city, it was impossible to ignore. Light flickered across faces and fields, constant reminder of what had been left behind. Sleep was fitful. Smoke drifted even into these areas, stinging eyes and throats. For some, fleeing was temporary. They hoped to return as soon as fire passed. For others, especially those whose homes were clearly lost, exile felt more permanent. Uncertainty weighed heavily. No one knew how long fire would burn or what would remain afterward. Despite hardship, communities formed quickly. People shared food, information, and labor. Familiar social structures reasserted themselves. Paris groups organized care for vulnerable. Informal leaders emerged. These adaptations demonstrated resilience even in displacement. Experience of fleeing reshaped how Londoners understood their city. Streets once taken for granted became obstacles remembered in frustration. Districts became memories rather than places. City long defined by stability and habit was now understood as fragile. Fire continued to advance behind them. But for those who had fled, immediate struggle shifted from escape to endurance. They waited, watched, and listened for news. Each rumor carried hope or dread. Each change in wind direction mattered. Ordinary Londoners did not flee because they were cowardly or unprepared. They fled because scale of disaster exceeded anything they could fight. Their movement was not chaos, but adaptation under extreme pressure. It was the city responding as living organism, redistributing itself to survive. This mass flight would leave lasting marks. It influenced how relief was organized, how rebuilding was planned, and how fire was remembered. Image of Londoners camped in fields and villages watching their city burn became one of defining memories of Great Fire. In midst of destruction, act of fleeing preserved life. Buildings could be rebuilt, goods could be replaced, lives could not. The decision to leave, difficult and painful, was often the difference between survival and tragedy. As fire continued its course, London existed in two forms at once. The burning city behind and the displaced city ahead. Both were London. Both carried its future, kota yang terurai. Pada saat fire mencapai eksten terbesarnya, London tidak lagi terlihat seperti city dalam arti biasa. Ia berubah menjadi sebuah proses, bukan sekadar place. Sebuah proses pembongkaran yang berlangsung street by street, hour by hour, seolah kota itu sedang dilepaskan dari bentuk lamanya di depan mata semua orang. Alamat yang sebelumnya fix mulai kehilangan arti. Rutes yang dulu familiar tidak lagi dapat dipercaya. Neighborhoods yang selama beberapa generasi memiliki nama, batas, dan identitas, tiba-tiba berubah menjadi smoke, ash, dan debris. Bagi orang-orang yang watching from a distance, London tampak larut menjadi broad field of flame and smoke. Dari kejauhan, kota itu bukan lagi kumpulan rumah, gereja, pasar, dan jalan, melainkan satu bentangan cahaya yang bergerak, berdenyut, dan terus memakan dirinya sendiri. Namun bagi mereka yang masih berada within its reach, pengalaman itu jauh lebih intimate dan jauh lebih disorienting. Destruction tidak datang ke semua tempat sekaligus. Ia bergerak unevenly, dibentuk oleh wind, building density, dan materials yang tersimpan di dalam tiap distrik. Beberapa streets terbakar fierce dan cepat, consumed in a matter of hours. Jalan yang pada pagi hari masih memiliki shopfront, window, signboard, dan household life, pada sore hari sudah menjadi line of embers. Yang lain resisted briefly, seolah masih memberi hope, tetapi resistance itu sering hanya sementara. Heat melemahkan walls, embers menemukan cracks, roofs yang tampak aman mulai smoke, lalu tiba-tiba ignited. Irregular pace ini menciptakan rhythm yang aneh. Ada moments of apparent calm, lalu sudden collapse. Ada streets yang tampak spared, lalu dalam minutes, seluruh blok menjadi flame. Markets termasuk civic spaces pertama yang hilang. Dalam normal times, markets adalah centers of daily exchange. Crowded, noisy, dan penuh movement. Di sana orang membeli bread, meat, cloth, tools, fruit, dan household goods. Di sana information berpindah secepat money. Suara tawar-menawar, carts, animals, dan footsteps biasanya memenuhi ruang. Sekarang, setelah ditinggalkan, tempat-tempat itu terbakar almost silently. Stalls collapse inward ketika flames memakan wooden frames. Goods yang beberapa hari sebelumnya diperdagangkan, cloth, sacks of grain, barrels of produce, semuanya menjadi fuel in place. Loss ini bukan hanya ekonomik, ia simbolik. Markets represented continuity and routine. Mereka adalah tanda bahwa city masih berjalan. Ketika markets terbakar, yang hilang bukan hanya barang dagangan, tetapi juga rhythm of daily life. London kehilangan salah satu cara utamanya untuk merasa normal. Homes followed, rows of houses yang packed tightly together terbakar bukan sebagai individual structures, tetapi sebagai units. Fire bergerak melalui shared walls dan roofs, turning entire blocks into single burning masses. Rumah yang secara legal milik keluarga berbeda, secara fisikal tersambung oleh timber, roofline, partitions, dan air gaps yang terlalu kecil untuk menghentikan flame. Interior yang tadinya private dan familiar terbuka hanya sebentar sebelum collapse. Furniture terlihat dari street. Personal objects muncul di tengah smoke. Domestic spaces, tempat orang makan, tidur, berbicara, dan menyimpan memori keluarga, tiba-tiba exposed to open air, lalu swallowed by flame. Glimpses singkat ini membuat loss terasa sangat intimate. Kehancuran bukan abstraction. Orang dapat melihat chair, chest, bedding, table, dan shelves menghilang. Shops dan workshops terbakar bersama residences. Tools melted. Workspaces collapsed. Years of labor disappeared in moments. Bagi craftsmen, ini bukan hanya loss of property, tetapi loss of identity. Trade tied to place. A. Carpenter membutuhkan tools dan bench. A. Printer membutuhkan press dan type. A. Cooper membutuhkan barrels, hoops, dan space. A. Merchant membutuhkan ledgers dan stock. Tanpa shop, craft tidak mudah. Continued. Fire disrupted livelihoods as thoroughly as it destroyed buildings. Civic buildings fared little better. Guild halls, meeting places, dan offices fell as fire advanced. Records kept for generations were lost. Charters, contracts, accounts, dan documents yang menentukan rights, obligations, ownership, debt, dan membership burned. Ini adalah jenis loss yang tidak selalu terlihat seperti tragedi pada saat flames masih roar, tetapi akan sangat terasa saat recovery dimulai. Institutional memory ikut terbakar. Claims of ownership menjadi difficult to verify. Old. Obligations menjadi hard to prove. Legal certainty yang menopang economic life ikut terguncang. Churches stood out against the flames, both physically and emotionally. Banyak dari gereja itu substantial structures, built with stone walls dan timber roofs. Untuk sementara, stone walls seemed to hold. People gathered around them, hoping they would serve as anchors in the chaos. Namun sustained heat proved relentless. Roofs caught fire. Beams collapsed inward. Begitu sebuah church fully involved, fire burned intensely, fed by wooden furnishings, roof timbers, stored materials, dan objeks yang dibawa ke sana untuk diselamatkan. Loss of churches struck deeply. Buildings ini bukan hanya places of worship. Mereka adalah centers of community identity. Parish boundaries define social life. Bells marked time and danger. Parish records tied births, marriages, deaths, duties, dan charity to a physical place. Ketika sebuah church burned, rasanya seperti satu piece of the city structure, both physical and social, had been removed. Soundscape kehangkuran constant dan overwhelming. Timber cracked and snapped as it burned. Roofs collapsed with dull thunder. Occasionally, sharper sounds cut through the roar. Ketika stored goods exploded atau walls fell outward. Sounds ini carried far, warning those ahead of the fire dan reminding those behind that it was still approaching. Visual transformation juga striking. Smoke turned daylight into a dim reddish haze. At times, sun appeared as dull disk, its light filtered through ash. Shadows shifted unpredictably as flames flickered. Night offered no relief, because fire illuminated city with a harsh, uneven glow. Boundary antara day dan night blurred. Heat altered perception. People near fire described feeling pushed by waves of hot air. Clothing grew uncomfortably warm even at a distance. Metal objects burned skin on contact. Heat shaped movement. It forced retreat even when flames were not yet visible. It created invisible barriers that guided human paths as surely as walls and streets. Riverfront, once a place of trade and activity, became corridor of destruction. Warehouses burned fiercely, their contents producing intense heat. Piers collapsed into the Thames. River reflected flames, amplifying spectacle. Boats crowded water, some carrying people and goods away, others attempting to assist. Smoke hung low over the surface, making navigation dangerous. As these tricks fell, map of London was effectively erased. Streets lost their function as reference points when landmarks vanished. People attempting to navigate found themselves disoriented, even in areas they had known all their lives. Seseorang yang sejak kecil tahu turn mana menuju home, church, shop, atau river, tiba-tiba berdiri di antara smoke dan rubble tanpa anchor. This disorientation increased danger. It trapped some, it slowed others. It made memory unreliable. Fire's progress exposed differences in construction quality and maintenance. Newer buildings, sometimes built with more brick, resisted slightly longer. Poorly maintained structures failed quickly. Houses dengan old timber, untreated beams, tarred surfaces, dan cluttered upper floors caught fast. Tetapi in the end, these differences mattered little. Sustained heat overcame most defenses. Once fire reached an area, it did not discriminate much by wealth or status. The emotional impact of watching city unmade was profound. Those who had fled earlier returned cautiously to observe from edges. Mereka mencari familiar landmarks in smoke and flame, mencoba locate where their homes had stood. Often, they could not. Absence itself became the most striking feature. Di tempat street seharusnya ada, hanya ada open space filled with debris and embers. Di tempat church tower seharusnya menjadi guide, hanya ada smoke. Di tempat market seharusnya menandai life, hanya ada ash. For those still within burning district, survival depended on constant movement and awareness. Rest nearly impossible. Decisions had to be made quickly and revised just as quickly. Paths thought safe minutes earlier became dangerous. A route open at noon could be cut off by mid-afternoon. A courtyard that looked like refuge could fill with smoke. A wall that seemed stable could collapse outward without warning. Sense of control minimal. Animals suffered alongside people. Livestock trapped in pens or stables perished. Pets were abandoned or lost in chaos. Horses, essential for transport, injured or exhausted. Some pulled carts through smoke until they could no longer move. Others panicked at heat and noise. Dead animals added to distress and complicated movement through streets already difficult to pass. Fire also altered cities' smells. Familiar mix of river, refuse, smoke, food, animals, then crowded human life was replaced by harsher blend. Burning wood, pitch, fabric, stored food, heated stone, and ash. Smell lingered everywhere. It clung to clothing and hair. It marked those who had been close to fire even after they escaped. Time itself seemed distorted. Without regular bells or routines, days and nights blurred together. People measured time by fire's movement rather than by clocks. Morning meant where fire had reached. Evening meant whether wind still drove it. Night meant glow. Memory became fragmented. Later accounts would struggle to place events in exact sequence, because the experience itself had broken ordinary time. As destruction continued, idea of saving the city gave way to saving parts of it. Efforts focused on protecting key areas that had not yet burned, using wide demolitions to halt fire's advance. These measures would eventually succeed, but only after much had already been lost. The unmaking of London was not total. Some districts remained intact. But core of city, its commercial, civic, and residential heart, was profoundly altered. Fire carved a vast scar through urban fabric, one that would shape rebuilding for decades. This unmaking was not simply physical. Social networks were disrupted. Economic systems stalled. Governance was challenged. The city's identity, long rooted in continuity, was forced to confront rupture. Londoners would later speak of fire as dividing time into before and after. As fire raged, people began to grasp scale of what was happening. Estimates of loss circulated, growing larger with each retelling. Numbers struggled to capture reality. How does one quantify loss of familiarity? How does one measure memory embedded in place? How does one count the disappearance of a street that was also childhood, trade, family, routine, and belonging? Fire did not pause for reflection. It continued to consume, reshape, and erase. But even within this process of destruction, foundations of recovery were being laid. The very emptiness left behind would make rebuilding possible in new ways. A city unmade is not simply destroyed. It is opened. Space appears where none existed. Old patterns are broken. What follows depends on choices made in aftermath. For London, this unmaking was a prelude, though no one living through it could yet see what would come next. As fire approached its limits, city behind it had been irrevocably changed. What remained standing did so by chance as much as design. Great fire had reduced London to essentials: people, ground, and will to begin again. Sante, pulse dalam api. Bagi banyak Londoners, momen ketika fire mencapai stay. Pulse katedral menandai poin ketika disbelief akhirnya berubah menjadi acceptance. Sampai titik itu, masih ada pockets of hope, belief that certain buildings were too important, too solid, or too symbolic to fall. Santa. Pulse represented all of these at once. It stood not only as spiritual heart of the city, but as landmark visible from across London, a structure that had endured centuries of storms, neglect, repair, and use. Jika ada sesuatu yang dapat withstand the fire, banyak orang percaya itu adalah stain. Pulse. Katedral yang berdiri pada 1666 bukan ST. Pulse yang dikenal hari ini, itu adalah Old Sten. Pulse, vast medieval building whose construction had spanned generations. Stone wallsnya thick, proportionnya immense. Navenya among the longest in Europe. Central spire, though damaged by lightning years earlier and replaced with a shorter structure, still dominated skyline for Londoners. Santenta. Pulse was not merely a church. It was a gathering place, a reference point, a symbol of endurance. Physical presence-nya shaped expectations. Stone, after all, did not burn. Simple truth ini carried great weight in a city built largely of wood. As fire advanced westward, many assumed Santa. Poles would act as natural barrier, slowing or stopping flames. Belief ini influenced decisions. Efforts to defend nearby areas were sometimes delayed or redirected in assumption that cathedral would hold. Orang-orang mengira bahwa jika fire mencapai katedral, stone walls dan scale bangunan itu akan memberi time, perhaps even safety. Seindah, Poles juga became a place of refuge and storage. As fire approached, People brought books, papers, furniture and goods into cathedral, believing its walls would protect their possessions. Printers stored valuable stock there. Merchants deposited records. Parishioners carried items of personal significance. Cathedral's vast interior filled with objects meant to be saved. Ironically, efforts to save possessions made the cathedral more vulnerable. It placed more fuel inside a building already facing danger from outside. At the same time, repairs were underway on the building. Scaffolding surrounded parts of exterior. Timber structures erected to support maintenance work clung to stone walls. These additions, though temporary, proved critical. They introduced fuel where little had existed before. Roof of old say. Paul's was constructed largely of timber covered with sheets of lead. This combination had protected building from rain for centuries, but it concealed vulnerability. Beneath lead lay dry wood, aged and weakened. Long, hot summer had dried it further. Cathedral's sheer size meant that once fire took hold, it would have room to spread internally. As fire drew closer, sparks began to land on cathedral's roof and scaffolding. At first, they were brushed off or extinguished. Observers took comfort in these small successes. Each spark defeated seemed to confirm belief that St. Paul's could survive. But wind remained steady. Volume of embers increased. Eventually, one ember found a place to settle where it could not easily be reached. Accounts differ on exact moment when St. Paul's caught fire. What is clear is that once ignition occurred, it was not immediately visible from the ground. Fire smoldered beneath lead sheets, fed by timber below. This hidden phase delayed response. By the time flames broke through, fire had already spread extensively. When roof finally ignited, effect was dramatic. Lead sheets heated rapidly, then began to melt. Molten lead flowed down roof and into streets below, a terrifying sight that revealed intensity of heat. Interior filled with smoke, wooden furnishings, scaffolding, and stored goods caught fire almost simultaneously. Scale of blaze inside cathedral shocked even those accustomed to city's destruction. St. Paul's did not burn like a house or shop. It burned like a contained furnace. Vast interior amplified heat. Air rushed in through doors and windows, feeding flames. Fire roared upward into roof space, consuming beams that had stood for centuries. The very size that had made cathedral seem safe now gave fire enormous internal volume in which to grow. Attempts to save building continued briefly. People tried to remove stored goods. Firefighters directed water streams where they could, but access was limited and heat overwhelming. Falling debris made entry dangerous. Within short time, it became clear cathedral could not be saved. Collapse of roof marked the end. As timber supports failed, sections of roof fell inward, sending showers of sparks and debris through nave. Stone walls, though they did not burn, cracked under thermal stress. Windows shattered. Interior, once a place of order and reverence, became chaos of flame and falling material. Emotional impact of St. Paul's burning was profound. For many Londoners, it felt as though city itself was being erased. Cathedral had outlasted kings, plagues, wars, and generations of daily worship. Its destruction suggested that nothing lay beyond fire's reach. This realization spread quickly, carried by word of mouth and by visible glow of burning roof. People watching from distance described sight as both mesmerizing and horrifying. Scale of building made fire visible from miles away. At night, burning cathedral dominated skyline. A vast crown of flame. Image imprinted itself on memory and would later appear in countless accounts and illustrations. Loss of St. Paul's was not only symbolic. It had practical consequences. Cathedral housed records, libraries, and offices. Its destruction meant loss of legal documents, ecclesiastical archives, and cultural materials accumulated over centuries. These losses complicated recovery and deepened sense of rupture. Fire at sea. Paul's also reshaped strategy. Any lingering belief that stone buildings could serve as safe havens or barriers was extinguished along with roof. From this point forward, defense efforts focused less on individual structures and more on creating wide, empty spaces through demolition. For clergy, burning of cathedral prompted intense reflection. Some interpreted it as sign of divine judgment. Others saw it as warning about human pride or neglect. Yet amid these interpretations, practical concerns dominated. Parish organization had to be re-established without its central landmark. Services would have to be held elsewhere. Community life would need new centers. Destruction of St. Paul's also influenced King's resolve. Charles II reportedly watched burning with deep concern. Loss underscored scale of disaster and reinforced need for decisive action. It also planted seed for rebuilding not just the city, but its symbolic heart. As cathedral burned, fire continued to spread around it. Nearby streets and buildings were consumed in quick succession. Area that had once been among most densely built in city became open expanse of rubble and embers. Skyline changed permanently. Aftermath of burning was stuck. When flames finally died down, what remained of St. Paul's was a shell. Walls stood blackened and cracked. Interior was open to sky. Floor buried under debris. Building no longer usable in any meaningful sense. Demolition would later be required to clear the site. In days following, Londoners returned to ruins, drawn by grief, curiosity, or necessity. Many searched for belongings stored in cathedral, though few found anything salvageable. Ruins became place of mourning and reckoning. Hasty, Paul's in flames became one of defining images of great fire. It symbolized loss, vulnerability, and end of an era. Yet it also became starting point. Decision to rebuild cathedral would lead to one of most ambitious architectural projects in England's history. At the time, however, such thoughts lay in future. As old St. Paul's burned, Londoners confronted reality that their city's past could be erased in days. Fire did not merely destroy buildings. It severed connections to history, memory, and identity. Burning of St. Paul's marked moment when fire's meaning shifted. It was no longer just disaster. It was transformation. Old city was gone in a way that could not be repaired or patched. What would come next would have to be new. As flames subsided around cathedral, smoke lingered, and ash settled over ruins. Great stone walls stood in silence, bearing witness to their own survival and their own failure. Around them, London continued to burn and change. Fire would eventually pass. Rebuilding would begin. A new St. Paul's would rise. But old St. Paul's, with all its accumulated history, had ended in flame. Its loss crystallized great fire in minds of those who lived through it and those who would remember it later. In that sense, Santamang Barmosin, Paul's did not simply burn. It marked the moment when London fully understood what it had lost and what it would have to become. Order melalui kehancuran. Pada hari keempat fire, sebuah hard and unsettling truth telah menetap di atas London. Satu-satunya cara untuk menyelamatkan what remained of the city adalah menghancurkan parts of it deliberately. Idea ini tidak baru. Fire breaks had long been understood in theory, dan small-scale demolitions had been used in earlier fires. Yang baru adalah scale now required. Great fire had grown beyond any previous experience, and stopping it demanded destruction on a level that felt almost indistinguishable from disaster itself. Logicnya simple, even if execution was not. Fire needs fuel. In a dense city built largely of wood, fuel was everywhere. The only reliable way to halt flames was to remove that fuel completely, creating wide gaps that fire could not cross. These gaps had to be substantial. Narrow alleys or removal of a single house would no longer suffice. Entire rows of buildings would need to come down. By this point, hesitation had largely given way to grim acceptance. Property owners who might earlier have protested now understood that delay meant total loss. Many were already homeless, their houses burned or burning. Question was no longer whether buildings would be destroyed, but which ones, and by whom. Royal authority played decisive role. Under direction of Duke of York and with King's full backing, demolition efforts became more systematic. Soldiers joined civilian laborers. Gunpowder, brought from military stores, was distributed to teams trained to use it. This marked significant shift. Response was no longer purely civic. It had become organized, forceful, and irreversible. Gunpowder was chosen because it could clear large areas quickly. Hooks and manual tearing were too slow for conditions. Fire advanced faster than men with ropes and axes could work. Explosives allowed walls and entire buildings to be brought down in moments, creating open spaces before flames arrived. Danger of this method was obvious, but danger of inaction was greater. Process was unsettling to watch. Buildings that still stood intact, some not yet touched by fire, were marked for destruction. Residents ordered to clear out immediately if they had not already done so. Explosions echoed through city, sharp and abrupt, distinct from roar of flames. Walls collapsed outward. Roofs fell inward. Dust and debris filled air. Controlled demolitions changed soundscape of fire. Continuous roar, now punctuated by sudden blasts. For those already displaced, explosions confirmed that city was being dismantled deliberately. For some, this brought relief. For others, it deepened sense of loss. Destruction was now purposeful, not accidental. Creating effective fire breaks required planning under pressure. Teams had to choose locations where gaps would intersect fire's likely path. Streets widened by removing entire blocks. In some areas, large open spaces carved out where dense neighborhoods had stood. These spaces were raw and uneven, filled with rubble, but they served their purpose. Wind remained a challenge. Even wide gaps could be crossed by embers carried high into air. For this reason, fire breaks had to be placed strategically, often in series. One break slowed fire. Several, aligned correctly, could stop it. Understanding ini emerged through trial and error. Some early breaks failed. Others succeeded. Each attempt taught those involved what kind of gap mattered and where fire was likely to leap. Coordination improved as necessity of order became clear. Military discipline helped. Orders were clearer. Chains of command more direct. Civilians working alongside soldiers adapted quickly, guided by necessity rather than training. Exhaustion remained severe, but purpose sharpened focus. Not all demolitions went smoothly. In some cases, buildings collapsed in unexpected ways, blocking routes or creating new hazards. Fires ignited debris piles. Injuries occurred. Yet compared to scale of fire itself, these incidents were limited. Overall effect of demolitions was unmistakable. Fire's advance began to slow. One of most critical areas was approached to western parts of city and toward Westminster. Protecting these areas became priority. Large fire breaks were cut aggressively. Destruction here was extensive, but it succeeded in preventing fire from consuming even more of capital. As fire encountered these gaps, its behavior changed. Flames reached edges of open spaces and faltered. Without nearby fuel, fires burned down rather than spreading onward. Embers fell harmlessly onto bare ground or stone. Wind still pushed, but there was nothing left for it to feed. This moment marked beginning of end, though it was not immediately obvious. Fires continued to burn within contained areas. Ruins smoldered. Smaller outbreaks flared when embers found isolated fuel. But unstoppable forward momentum had been broken. For those overseeing effort, emotional cost of success was heavy. They had saved parts of city by destroying others. Streets that might have survived if fire had taken a different path were now gone by human decision. Moral weight in it would linger long after flames were extinguished. Londoners who returned to observe results of demolition struggled to reconcile sight. Some neighborhoods ended not in fire, but in sudden absence. Rows of houses stopped abruptly, replaced by open ground and shattered stone. It was destruction without familiar marks of burning, and it felt strangely final. Yet there was also sense of control returning. For first time since fire began, people could point to lines on ground and say with some confidence that fire would not pass beyond them. Certainty ini, however limited, restored a measure of calm. Order through destruction became the defining strategy of fire's final phase. It was harsh solution born of necessity rather than choice. It reflected shift in understanding. Preserving whole required sacrificing parts, and clinging to every building guaranteed loss of all. As night fell again, city no longer glowed uniformly. Large sections were dark, empty, and silent. Other areas still burned, but fire now contained within boundaries drawn by human hands. Smoke continued to rise, but horizon no longer advanced. Great fire forced London to accept brutal lesson. Sometimes survival requires deliberate loss. Sometimes order can only be restored by tearing down what once seemed indispensable. By the time final flames began to weaken, it was clear these acts of controlled destruction had saved Western City. Westminster remained intact. Seat of government was spared. London, though devastated, still existed. Scars left by these fire breaks would shape city's future. They created opportunities for new streets, wider roads, and different planning. At the time, however, such possibilities were distant thoughts. What mattered was that fire was finally being stopped. Order had been achieved, not through preservation, but through courage to destroy in order to save. And with that difficult balance struck, London moved slowly toward the end of fire and beginning of reckoning. Api mereda. Pada pagi Kamis, 6 September, Great Fire of London began to exhaust itself. Ini bukan sudden ending, bukan moment yang dapat announce clearly. Tidak ada single hour ketika city knew danger had passed. Instead, fire weakened gradually, losing relentless certainty that had defined its advance for days. What remained was heat without momentum, flame without direction, and a city that dared cautiously to believe the worst was over. Change first noticed in small ways. In areas where fire breaks had been cut wide and deep, flames reached open ground and faltered. Without adjacent buildings to feed on, they burned downward rather than outward. Charred timbers collapsed into themselves. Roofs that might once have ignited now lay already destroyed or absent. Embers fell onto bare earth, stone or rubble and died there, hissing briefly before going dark. Wind, so crucial to fire's earlier power, began to ease. It did not vanish entirely, but its steady force weakened enough to break destructive partnership that had carried flames across city. Smoke still drifted, but no longer surged with same urgency. Air felt different, heavy, stale, thick with ash, yet calmer. Firefighters and laborers, exhausted beyond measure, continued their work with renewed focus. Instead of chasing advancing flames, they now patrolled boundaries, stumping out smaller outbreaks before they could grow. Buckets were used not to fight walls of fire, but to douse glowing beams and smoking debris. Watchfulness replaced desperation. Soundscape shifted noticeably. Roar that had filled city day and night faded into something quieter and more fragmented. Instead of continuous thunder of destruction, there were isolated cracks as weakened structures finally collapsed, and soft rushing sounds as smoldering ruins breathed out their last heat. For first time in days, moments of relative silence appeared. These moments were unsettling. Londoners had grown accustomed to noise of disaster. Silence felt unnatural, almost suspicious. People listened carefully, trying to determine whether quiet signaled safety or merely pause before renewed destruction. Gradually, confidence grew as hours passed without fresh surges of flame. Those who had remained on outskirts of fire zone began to edge closer. Cautious groups approached ruins, stopping often to assess danger. Heat still radiated from ground in many places. Smoke rose from cracks and piles of debris. It was not yet safe to move freely, but curiosity and necessity pulled people inward. Landscape they encountered was altered beyond recognition. Streets no longer clearly defined. Familiar paths ended abruptly in fields of rubble. Charred beams lay tangled together, still warm to touch. Stone walls stood alone, stripped of roofs and floors, like incomplete sketches of buildings that had once been whole. Fire continued to burn in pockets across city. Some areas smoldered for days longer, hidden beneath debris where air still reached buried embers. These fires required constant attention. A careless step or a strong breeze could reignite destruction. Work of extinguishing fire was not dramatic, but painstaking and essential. Officials began to take stock even before fire was fully out. Messengers moved through safer districts, reporting which areas had burned and which remained intact. Rough boundaries of destruction sketched out. Early assessments imperfect, but they helped shape next phase of response. Psychological shift was as significant as physical one. Fear did not disappear. It changed form. Instead of immediate panic, there was shock, grief, and fatigue. Londoners, who had lived for days in constant motion, now found themselves with nothing to do but wait and look. Many struggled to absorb what they were seeing. For those whose homes lay within burned area, hope narrowed to fragments. They searched ruins for recognizable objects, bits of pottery, metal fittings, anything that might confirm where their lives had once been anchored. Most found little. Fire had erased boundaries between houses, mixing possessions into indistinguishable debris. Those whose homes had survived experienced different tension. Relief mixed with guilt. They knew how close destruction had come. They saw neighbors who had lost everything. Survival felt fragile, almost accidental. This awareness would shape how communities responded in weeks to come. Religious reflection intensified as fire faded. Services held outdoors or in surviving churches. Clergy spoke to congregations gathered in unfamiliar places. Interpretations varied, but dominant tone was sober rather than triumphant. Survival was not framed as victory, but responsibility. King Charles II and his advisors moved more openly through city, inspecting damage and speaking with officials. Presence America signaled transition. Emergency phase ending. Governance and recovery would now take precedence. Orders shifted from demolition to stabilization. From response to planning, Duke of York continued to oversee patrols and safety efforts, ensuring flare-ups addressed quickly. His role, once urgent and improvisational, became more administrative. Discipline remained necessary, but sense of imminent catastrophe had passed. As smoke thinned, scale of destruction became more apparent. From elevated points, observers could see vast swathes of city reduced to ash and rubble. Burned area formed broad scar running from eastern riverfront through heart of London. Estimates of damage began to circulate, growing more precise as surveying continued. Despite devastation, life began to reassert itself almost immediately. Vendors appeared near edges of ruins, selling food and drink to laborers and returning residents. Temporary shelters reinforced. Paths cleared through debris. Small signs of activity marked cities' refusal to remain inert. Fires fading also revealed resilience of infrastructure that had survived. Wells still provided water. Some bridges remained intact. Portions of street network could be restored. These survivals, modest as they were, mattered deeply. They formed skeleton around which recovery could begin. Yet even as activity resumed, fire's presence lingered in sensory ways. Smell of smoke clung stubbornly to air. Ash coated surfaces. Clothing carried scent of burning no matter how often it was washed. London would smell of fire for months. Night returned to something like darkness. Without citywide glow of flames, sky felt unfamiliar. Stars were visible again in clearer patches. Return of Ordinary Night marked profound emotional milestone. He suggested the city might one day return to ordinary days as well. End of fire did not bring immediate comfort. It brought exposure. With destruction no longer hidden by flame and smoke, loss stood fully revealed. City had survived, but in altered form. People now had to confront long work ahead. Great Fire did not end with dramatic final blaze. It ended quietly, unevenly, and without ceremony. Last embers faded while people were already thinking about shelter, food, and rebuilding. Fire's conclusion blended into beginning of aftermath. London stood at threshold. Behind it lay days of chaos and terror. Ahead lay uncertainty, effort, and change. Fire had reshaped city, but it had not erased its inhabitants. As last smoke drifted away, Londoners remained, ready or not, to face what came next. Menghitung reruntuhan. Ketika fire finally loosened its hold on London, city entered a phase that felt to many more overwhelming than fire itself. During blaze, attention had been fixed on movement, survival, and immediate danger. Now, with flames largely extinguished, Londoners were left with stillness. And, in that stillness, full scale of what had happened began to emerge. Taking stock of ruin was not a single act. It was slow, uneven process unfolding over days and weeks, shaped by shock, necessity, and sheer difficulty of understanding loss on such scale. First attempts to assess damage were tentative. Officials, surveyors, and messengers moved cautiously through burned districts, navigating unstable ground and smoldering debris. Many areas remained too hot or structurally unsound to enter safely. Walls leaned at dangerous angles. Cellars had collapsed. Piles of rubble shifted unexpectedly underfoot. Work of measurement and record-keeping advanced slowly, constrained by physical danger and exhaustion. What became immediately clear, even without precise numbers, was that heart of city had been gutted. Entire parishes no longer existed as coherent places. Streets ended abruptly or vanished altogether. Familiar routes were replaced by open expanses of ash and broken stone. Londoners returning to search for their homes often struggled to locate where they had once lived. Without landmarks, memory itself became unreliable. Destruction followed broad, uneven band, stretching from eastern riverfront through commercial core and into western reaches of city. Fire had not burned uniformly. Some pockets within this zone remained standing, often by chance rather than design. These surviving structures appeared almost surreal amid devastation. Isolated islands of familiarity, surrounded by emptiness. Their survival prompted questions and comparisons few could answer. Counting losses proved difficult. Early estimates varied widely. Some reports spoke of tens of thousands of houses destroyed. Others attempted to calculate losses by parish or ward. Over time, figures became clearer. Thousands of homes gone, scores of churches reduced to ruins, civic buildings destroyed, warehouses emptied not by removal but by fire. Yet even these numbers failed to capture human dimension. Homelessness became most immediate and pressing concern. Tens of thousands of Londoners had no roof to return to. Many were already camped outside city in makeshift shelters. Others crowded into surviving districts, staying with relatives, friends, or strangers. Overcrowding intensified. Sanitation deteriorated. Disease became concern once again, though mercifully no major outbreak followed immediately. City authorities faced logistical challenges unlike any they had known. Providing shelter, food, and order for such displaced populations strained resources to limit. Temporary housing improvised where possible. Tents, sheds, and rough wooden structures appeared on edges of city and in open spaces within it. These were intended as short-term solutions, but many would remain for months. Food supply was another urgent issue. Markets within burned area were gone. Warehouses storing grain and other staples destroyed. Transport routes disrupted. Prices rose quickly. Poor hit hardest, lacking reserves or credit. Authorities intervened where they could, regulating prices and encouraging supplies from surrounding areas. Measures mitigated worst effects, but could not fully erase hardship. Economic loss extended beyond immediate survival. Merchants had lost stock. Craftsmen had lost tools and workshops. Records of debts, contracts, and ownership burned. Legal disputes loomed as people tried to reconstruct claims from memory or partial documentation. Fire had not merely destroyed property. It had disrupted systems that defined economic relationships. Insurance, still developing concept, proved inadequate to scale of disaster. Many losses uninsured or underinsured. Reality forced individuals and institutions to rely on personal resources, charity, or royal assistance. It also spurred new thinking about risk and protection that would shape future financial practices. Crown moved to assert stability and reassurance. King Charles II issued proclamations addressing relief, order, and rebuilding. He emphasized city would be restored and assistance provided. Statements ini important psychologically, signaling continuity of governance even as physical city lay in ruins. At same time, King established commissions to investigate causes of fire and oversee reconstruction. Bodies ini tasked with gathering evidence, hearing testimony, and making recommendations. Their work began amid uncertainty and emotion, complicating search for clear conclusions. Blame became undercurrent in process of taking stock. People sought reasons for loss, and in doing so sought responsibility. Rumors of arson surfaced, often directed at foreigners or marginalized groups. Despite official efforts to counter these narratives, suspicion lingered. A French watchmaker, Robert Hubert, would later be accused and executed despite evidence of his innocence. His case reflected need many felt to attach blame even when facts did not support it. Physical act of clearing debris became massive undertaking. Before rebuilding could begin, ruins had to be stabilized or removed. This required labor, tools, and organization. Rubble sorted. Salvageable materials recovered where possible. Stone blocks reused. Bricks cleaned. Metal melted down. Even in devastation, nothing was wasted if it could be repurposed. Clearing city also meant addressing hazards. Smoldering remains pose fire risks. Unstable walls threatened collapse. Wells and drains had been damaged or contaminated. Each hazard required attention. Work was slow and often dangerous, carried out by laborers who themselves had lost homes and livelihoods. As ruins were surveyed, patterns emerged. Officials could see which areas had been most vulnerable, which building practices had failed fastest, and which had offered some resistance. Observations ini informed early discussions about rebuilding. Fire had created, inadvertently, a vast urban laboratory. Londoners themselves participated in this assessment informally. Conversations turned to comparisons. Whose house had burned first? Whose street had survived longest? Where had fire jumped unexpectedly? Stories circulated widely, shaping collective understanding. Memory and myth began to intertwine, even as facts were still being gathered. Loss of churches weighed heavily on communities. Parishes that had defined social life for generations were suddenly without physical centers. Clergy held services outdoors or in surviving buildings, often combining congregations. Gatherings ini served not only religious functions, but social ones, allowing people to share news and support. Education disrupted as schools burned or repurposed as shelters. Children's routines vanished. Apprenticeships interrupted. Long-term effects difficult to measure, but they added to sense that normal life had been suspended indefinitely. For elite and wealthy, fire brought different challenges. Many had resources to relocate temporarily or rebuild quickly, but they also faced significant losses. Grand houses within city destroyed. Collections of art, books, and furnishings burned. Social life shifted westward toward less affected areas, subtly altering city's cultural geography. Process of taking stock also involved emotional reckoning. Grief widespread, but often private. Public mourning limited, in part because scale of loss made individual expression difficult. There were relatively few recorded deaths compared to destruction, but this fact did little to lessen sorrow. Loss of home and livelihood carried its own trauma. Some Londoners experienced sense of unreality. Walking through ruins felt like moving through dream or nightmare. Familiar sounds absent, city seemed hollowed out. This disorientation lingered long after physical danger had passed. Yet, alongside grief was pragmatic determination. People began to plan, make lists, imagine next steps. Temporary solutions accepted with understanding. They were temporary. Language of rebuilding entered everyday conversation. Hope, cautious and conditional, began to take shape. Taking stock extended beyond city itself. News of fire spread across England and beyond. Letters described devastation. Donations arrived from other towns and abroad. London's importance as national and international center ensured its loss was felt widely. External attention brought aid, but also scrutiny. As weeks passed, assessments became more systematic. Maps drawn showing burned areas. Surveys measured plots. Records reconstructed. Administrative work laid foundation for rebuilding. It also imposed order on chaos, transforming lived experience into data. Act of taking stock was in effect first step toward recovery. It required facing loss directly without distraction of immediate danger. It demanded patience, cooperation, and resilience. For Londoners, it was exhausting but necessary transition. City emerging from this process was not yet rebuilt, but redefined. Ruins were not merely evidence of destruction. They were raw material of a new London. Every measurement, every cleared path, every provisional shelter contributed to shape of what would follow. In quiet after fire, London confronted itself. It counted what was gone, acknowledged what remained, and began slowly to imagine what could be rebuilt. Work of taking stock did not heal wounds, but made healing possible. Out of ash and rubble, a reckoning took place. Practical, emotional, and deeply human. London had survived fire. Now it had to understand what survival meant. Blame, fear, then rumor. As smoke thinned and ruins cooled, a different kind of fire began to spread through London. One that fed not on timber or wind, but on fear, anger, and uncertainty. In absence of clear answers, people searched for causes that went beyond accident and circumstance. Great fire had destroyed too much, too completely, to be accepted easily as a result of chance. For many Londoners, understanding disaster meant finding someone to blame. Impulse emerged almost immediately, even while fire still burned. Whispers circulated through camps and crowded streets. Some said fire had started in more than one place. Others claimed they had seen suspicious figures throwing fireballs or spreading pitch. Each retelling added detail, urgency, and certainty. In a city already shaped by recent war and lingering political tension, stories seperti ini menemukan ground yang subur. England sedang berperang dengan Dutch Republic pada 1666, dan hostility toward foreigners already existed before fire began. Dutch and French merchants lived and worked in London, particularly near riverfront. Their presence, once tolerated or even welcomed for economic reasons, now became suspect. Accents, unfamiliar customs, and foreign dress drew attention in ways they had not before. Crowds gathered around anyone rumored to be foreigner. In some cases, violence followed. People were detained, questioned, and beaten based on little more than hearsay. Breakdown of normal order during fire had created opportunities for fear and aggression to flourish. Once immediate danger passed, these emotions did not simply disappear. They turned inward, seeking explanation. Religious interpretation also shaped blame. Some preachers framed fire as divine punishment for moral failings, sin, pride, or religious division. Sermons ini did not always name specific individuals, but reinforced idea that disaster had purpose. If fire was judgment, then someone or something must have deserved it. Moral framing made accidental explanations feel insufficient. Political suspicion added another layer. England's recent history of civil war and regicide had left deep scars. Trust in authority fragile. Some Londoners believed fire had been allowed to spread deliberately, either through incompetence or conspiracy. Hesitation of city officials in early hours became focal point for criticism. Decisions that seemed cautious at time now appeared negligent in hindsight. Rumors also targeted marginalized groups within city. Catholics, already viewed with suspicion in Protestant England, became subjects of accusation. Great fire occurred in climate where plots, religious fear, and political paranoia were easy to ignite. To some, it seemed plausible that fire was part of broader conspiracy. Authorities attempted to counter these narratives. Proclamations issued, urging calm and warning against vigilante violence. King Charles II himself spoke against attacks on foreigners, emphasizing fire was not result of enemy action. Efforts ini had mixed success. Official voices carried weight, but competed with personal testimony and emotional conviction. Search for blame eventually focused on individuals. Most infamous case was Robert Hubert, a French watchmaker. Hubert confessed to starting fire, claiming he had thrown a fireball into a bakery on Pudding Lane. Confessionnya inconsistent and contradicted by evidence, including fact that he had arrived in London after fire had already begun. Nonetheless, he was convicted and executed. Hubert's case revealed depth of need for explanation. His confession, however flawed, offered closure of a kind. It allowed fire to be framed as act with author rather than convergence of conditions and failures. For authorities, execution signaled justice had been done. For public, it provided focal point for grief and anger. Yet doubts persisted. Many recognized implausibility of Hubert's story. Some accounts questioned fairness of his trial even at time. Doubts ini did not prevent narrative from taking hold, but they lingered, adding complexity to fire's legacy. Beyond individual blame, fear shaped behavior in subtle ways. People remained wary of one another. Strangers viewed with suspicion. Even familiar neighbors sometimes scrutinized, especially if they had behaved unexpectedly during fire. Trust, once eroded, slow to rebuild. Camps of displaced Londoners became spaces where rumors circulated freely. Information traveled by word of mouth, shaped by emotion and repetition. Without reliable news sources, stories evolved rapidly. Each retelling emphasized danger and intention. Fires in other cities, past or present, invoked as comparisons, often inaccurately. Economic fear also fed suspicion. Competition for scarce resources intensified. Rising prices for food and materials bred resentment. Accusations of profiteering circulated, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. Merchants who survived fire intact were sometimes viewed with envy or mistrust. Process of rebuilding further inflamed tensions. Decisions about where and how to rebuild affected livelihoods and property values. Disputes arose over land boundaries now erased by fire. In these disputes, fire itself became weapon in argument, cited as evidence of divine favor, misfortune, or wrongdoing. Despite these pressures, London did not descend into sustained chaos. Presence of royal authority and gradual return of order helped contain violence. Courts resumed operation. Legal processes addressed disputes, however imperfectly. Over time, most extreme rumors lost force. Still, period of blame and fear left marks. It influenced how fire was remembered and narrated. Early accounts emphasized conspiracy and malice more than later ones. Over time, as rebuilding progressed and city regained stability, explanations shifted toward accident and systemic vulnerability. Evolution ini reflected not just new information, but emotional distance. For historians, this phase of aftermath offers insight into how societies process disaster. Blame serves psychological functions. It imposes order on chaos. It offers moral clarity where physical explanations feel unsatisfying. In London's case, it also exposed existing fault lines: national, religious, and economic, that fire did not create but did intensify. Fear that followed fire was not entirely irrational. Londoners had witnessed their city destroyed in days. They had seen systems fail and authority hesitate. Distrust was a natural response. What mattered was how that fear was eventually managed. Over time, practical needs overshadowed suspicion. Shelter, work, and rebuilding demanded cooperation. As people labored side by side, clearing rubble and raising new structures, shared purpose gradually replaced accusation. Memory of fire shifted from immediate trauma to collective experience. Yet stories told during this period did not vanish. They entered pamphlets, sermons, and later histories. Some repeated uncritically, others challenged. Together, they formed layered narrative in which fact, fear, and interpretation coexisted. Great Fire of London was not only physical catastrophe, it was social and psychological one. Flames exposed not just wooden beams and dry roofs, but anxieties rooted in war, religion, and identity. Blame and rumor were part of fire's afterburn, extending its impact beyond days it burned. In time, London would learn to explain fire differently, focusing on structure, planning, and prevention. But in immediate aftermath, understanding came through emotion more than analysis. Fear sought a face. Blame sought a name. This phase, uncomfortable and often unjust, was nonetheless part of city's path forward. It revealed vulnerabilities not just in buildings, but in trust. Confronting these vulnerabilities became as important as rebuilding streets and houses. As London moved slowly from suspicion toward reconstruction, echoes of fear faded. But they did not disappear entirely. They remained embedded in memory, reminder that disasters burn not only cities but fragile bonds that hold them together. Membangun ulang sebuah ibu kota. When urgency of blame and rumor began to recede, it was replaced by challenge no less daunting. How to rebuild a capital that in many places had ceased to exist. Rebuilding London was not a single project, nor unified vision carried smoothly from plan to completion. It was long negotiation between ambition and reality, shaped by competing interests, limited resources, and sheer scale of what had been lost. Fire had cleared space, but it had not cleared disagreement. Almost immediately, proposals for New London began to circulate. Architects, surveyors, and thinkers saw in ruins opportunity to correct centuries of unplanned growth. Fire had erased medieval street patterns in vast areas. Where once there had been tangled lanes and overhanging houses, there was now open ground. Some imagined city of wide boulevards, orderly grids, and grand public spaces. Others envisioned improved sanitation, fire-resistant construction, and clearer separation between residential and commercial areas. Among notable figures to put forward ideas was Christopher Wren, already known for work as scientist and architect. His plans, like those of several contemporaries, proposed rational layout inspired by classical ideals. Streets would be widened. Traffic would flow more easily. Churches and public buildings would anchor neighborhoods with deliberate symmetry. Fire, if it ever returned, would be easier to contain. These visions were ambitious and in many ways forward-looking. Yet they faced immediate obstacles. London was not an empty site owned by a single authority. Property rights deeply entrenched. Even where buildings had burned completely, land ownership remained. Thousands of individuals held claims to plots now reduced to ash. Rebuilding had to respect these claims or risk endless legal conflict. Urgency of shelter further constrained planning. Tens of thousands still displaced. Temporary housing could not remain temporary indefinitely. People needed roofs, workshops, and shops to resume life and work. Grand plans, requiring years of surveying and negotiation, were difficult to justify when immediate needs pressed. Crown and city authorities sought compromise. Rather than redesigning entire city, they focused on establishing new building regulations that would shape reconstruction within existing property lines. This approach preserved ownership while addressing some vulnerabilities revealed by fire. One of most significant changes concerned materials. New laws required houses be built of brick or stone rather than timber, at least in central areas. Roofs were to be tiled rather than thatched. Party walls between buildings thickened to reduce fire spread. Measures in it did not eliminate risk, but significantly reduced it. Street widths also addressed, though less radically than some planners had hoped. In certain areas, streets widened where possible, especially where demolition during fire had already created space. Elsewhere, widening limited by existing boundaries. Result was, city improved in places, but still shaped by past. Rebuilding process required extensive coordination. Surveyors mapped plots anew, establishing boundaries where markers had been destroyed. Courts set up to resolve disputes quickly, preventing legal paralysis. These courts aimed for pragmatism over perfection, prioritizing progress. Financing reconstruction posed another challenge. Many property owners lacked resources to rebuild immediately. Loans arranged, partnerships formed. In some cases, plots changed hands as owners sold to those with greater means. Process ini altered social composition of some neighborhoods, introducing new patterns of ownership and investment. Trades gradually returned. Brickmakers, masons, carpenters, and laborers found abundant work. Demand for materials reshaped surrounding regions as clay pits worked and stone quarried. Rebuilding London became an economic engine in its own right, drawing labor from across England. Church reconstruction central concern. With dozens of parish churches destroyed, religious life required new spaces. Wren and others commissioned to design replacements. These new churches, built over decades, would become defining features of London's skyline. They reflected both continuity of worship and transformation of architectural style. The answer. Paul's Cathedral, in particular, became symbol of renewal. Decision to rebuild it on grand scale deliberate. New cathedral would not merely replace what had been lost. It would assert London's resilience and ambition. Construction would take decades, but commitment made early, anchoring rebuilding effort in shared goal. Public infrastructure also demanded attention. Water supply systems damaged by fire had to be repaired or replaced. Drainage reconsidered. Markets relocated or redesigned. Each improvement required negotiation between cost, benefit, and tradition. Rebuilding uneven in pace. Wealthier districts rose more quickly. Poorer areas lagged. Temporary structures remained longer than intended. Contrast between newly built brick houses and makeshift shelters highlighted ongoing inequality. Authorities attempted to address disparities, but resources finite. Despite challenges, momentum built steadily. Sight of new walls rising where ruins had stood offered tangible reassurance. Each completed house or shop represented not just recovery but confidence. City was not merely surviving, it was asserting continuity. Cultural life adapted as well. Theaters reopened. Coffee houses, many rebuilt from scratch, became centers of discussion and exchange. These spaces played crucial role in shaping public opinion and fostering sense of shared experience. Fire became common reference point, discussed and interpreted in countless conversations. Memory of fire influenced design choices beyond formal regulations. Builders and residents alike more cautious. Chimneys better constructed. Storage of flammable goods reconsidered. These changes not always codified, but reflected lessons learned through loss. Rebuilding London did not erase grief. For many, returning to rebuilt streets meant confronting absence. Neighbors gone, familiar rhythms altered. Emotional undercurrents coexisted with determination. Over time, city that emerged was recognizably London, but different in character. Brick replaced timber. Streets felt more open. Skyline changed. Fire had not erased history, but redirected it. Rebuilding a capital is never merely a technical task. It involves choices about identity, memory, and future risk. In London's case, these choices made incrementally, shaped by compromise rather than vision alone. Result was not ideal city imagined by planners, but more resilient one. Great Fire thus became both end and beginning. It closed chapter on medieval London and opened another defined by regulation, planning, and adaptation. Rebuilt city carried scars, but also strengths born of experience. As walls rose and streets filled again with life, Londoners learned to inhabit a city shaped by fire without being defined by it. Work of rebuilding continued for decades, but foundations were laid in these early years when necessity guided innovation and loss demanded change. Kota yang berubah, As rebuilding advanced and raw urgency of survival faded, London entered quieter but no less significant phase of transformation. Fire had ended. Rubble had been cleared in many places. New walls were rising. But beneath visible recovery lay deeper changes that reshaped how city functioned, governed itself, and understood its past. London was no longer merely repaired. It was altered in ways that would persist long after memories of smoke and flame had softened. One of most immediate changes was visual. Rebuilt city looked different. Brick facades replaced timber frames. Roof lines became more uniform. Party walls stood thicker and higher, breaking continuous surfaces that had once allowed fire to race unchecked from house to house. Even where medieval street patterns survived, character of those streets shifted. London felt heavier, more solid, less improvised. These changes affected how people moved through city. Streets widened where possible, allowing cars to pass more easily. Traffic flowed with slightly less friction. Congestion did not disappear. London remained crowded, but movement felt more deliberate. City no longer leaned inward quite so aggressively. Space, once luxury, had been reclaimed in small but meaningful ways. Fire consciousness became embedded in everyday thinking. Londoners did not need reminders of what unchecked flame could do. Chimneys inspected more carefully. Hearths treated with greater caution. Storage of flammable goods, especially within residential areas, drew more scrutiny. No city could eliminate fire risk entirely, but London had learned to live with it differently. Governance also changed. Fire exposed weaknesses in authority, coordination, and emergency response. In aftermath, city placed greater emphasis on regulation and oversight. Building codes enforced more consistently. Surveyors and inspectors gained prominence. Relationship between civic authority and private property shifted subtly toward collective safety. Insurance practices expanded as well. Fire demonstrated how devastating loss could be when risk borne individually. New fire insurance companies emerged, offering policies covering rebuilding costs. These companies employed their own private fire brigades, marking early step toward professionalized firefighting. Though brigades served policyholders first, their presence contributed to broader urban safety. Economic life adapted to new realities. Some trades relocated permanently to less crowded districts. Others consolidated, operating from fewer but larger premises. Fire accelerated trends already underway, nudging London toward more centralized and capital-intensive economy. Shift favored those with resources and connections, subtly altering class dynamics. Geography of prestige shifted as well. Wealthy residents increasingly favored areas west of old city core, where rebuilding had been less chaotic and space more available. This westward drift reinforced patterns that would continue into 18th century, shaping London's social map. City remained commercial heart, but residential life diversified. Culturally, fire became reference point for identity. Londoners spoke of life before and after fire as distinct eras. Stories of escape, loss, and survival circulated within families and communities. Narratives in here retold not to dwell on trauma, but to anchor memory. Fire became part of how London explained itself. Art and literature reflected this shift. Writers described ruins and rebuilding with mix of sobriety and resolve. Fire no longer framed purely as divine punishment or random disaster, but as turning point demanding learning. Pragmatic interpretation ini distinguished later accounts from emotionally charged pamphlets of immediate aftermath. Religious life adapted to new urban landscape. Rebuilt churches, many designed by Christopher Wren, offered spaces that felt lighter and more ordered than medieval predecessors. Buildings ini embodied balance between continuity and change. Worship continued, but in settings shaped by fire-aware design. St. Paul's Cathedral, though still under construction for many years, became focal symbol of changed city. Its rising dome signaled not return to past, but confident step into different future. Londoners watched its progress as sign that city's identity could be renewed without being erased. Education and learning also felt fire's influence. Loss of libraries and records highlighted fragility of knowledge stored in physical form. Efforts to preserve documents and books gained urgency. Institutions became more conscious of archiving and redundancy, understanding that memory itself required protection. Public attitudes toward disaster evolved. Fire did not eliminate superstition or fear, but tempered them with experience. Londoners had seen catastrophe could arise from ordinary conditions, not just extraordinary causes. Awareness ini encouraged planning, preparation, and cautious respect for complexity. Legal system reflected these lessons. New courts and procedures developed to handle disputes efficiently. Property law adapted to address rebuilding and compensation. These changes did not solve every conflict, but reduced paralysis. City had learned that delay carried its own risks. Social bonds strained during fire and aftermath gradually reformed. Shared experience fostered sense of collective identity that crossed some traditional boundaries. Inequalities persisted, but there was broader recognition that disaster did not discriminate. Understanding ini influenced charitable efforts and civic engagement. London's changed character extended beyond its walls. City's experience became reference point for other towns and cities across England and Europe. Observers studied London's rebuilding to learn how urban centers might adapt to large-scale disaster. In this way, Great Fire's impact reached far beyond Thames. Memory of fire preserved deliberately. Monuments erected. Anniversaries marked. Acts ini ensured disaster would not fade into obscurity. Remembering fire was not about dwelling on loss, but about reinforcing lessons learned through suffering. Yet, for all these changes, continuity remained. Londoners returned to markets, taverns, workshops, and churches. Life resumed its rhythms, altered but recognizable. City's energy, its capacity for trade and exchange, remained intact. Change did not extinguish character. It reshaped it. Great Fire had stripped London down to essentials and forced reconsideration of habits long taken for granted. In response, city emerged more regulated, more cautious, and more resilient. These qualities did not make London immune to future disasters, but improved its capacity to respond. A changed city is not defined solely by what has been built, but by what has been learned. London carried forward memory of fire as quiet companion to progress. Each brick laid, each regulation enforced, reflected understanding earned at great cost. By the time rebuilding was well underway, London was no longer simply recovering. It was redefining itself. City that emerged was not London of memory, nor London of ideal plans, but something in between. Practical, scarred, and enduring. Fire had taken much, but it had also forced clarity. London had confronted vulnerability and responded with adaptation. That response, more than flames themselves, defined city's future. Warisan Great Fire. Long after last embers cooled and sound of rebuilding replaced roar of flames, Great Fire of London continued to exert influence in ways both obvious and subtle. Its legacy did not reside solely in architecture or law, nor only in memory and story, but in quiet assumptions that shaped how Londoners thought about risk, responsibility, and city itself. Fire became reference point, shared experience against which future choices measured, often without being explicitly named. One of most enduring legacies of fire was the idea that cities are systems, not just collections of buildings. Before 1666, London had grown through accumulation rather than coordination. Streets followed habit. Construction followed convenience. Fire revealed consequences of that approach with brutal clarity. In response, London did not become perfectly planned, but it became consciously governed. Urban growth was no longer entirely organic. It was managed, regulated, and debated. This shift altered how authority was understood. Fire demonstrated that individual decisions, how a house was built, how goods were stored, how quickly action was taken, could have consequences far beyond individual. Collective safety became legitimate reason for collective rules. Principle ini underpinned new building codes, fire regulations, and enforcement practices. Over time, it reshaped relationship between private property and public good. Fire insurance, still in infancy before 1666, expanded rapidly afterward. Idea that risk could be shared, quantified, and managed financially gained credibility. Insurance companies not only offered compensation, but actively invested in prevention. Their private fire brigades, though limited and sometimes selective, represented important step toward organized urban firefighting. Developments in influenced other cities and laid groundwork for modern emergency services. Fire also left lasting imprint on London's physical memory. Monument erected near site of fire's origin served not merely as memorial, but as statement of interpretation. Its inscriptions framed fire as lesson learned and overcome. The wording would be contested and revised over time. Monument symbolized desire to control narrative, as well as rebuild structure. In education and scholarship, fire encouraged documentation and analysis. Diaries, letters, and reports written during and after disaster became valuable records. Samuel Pepys's account, among others, offered detailed observations that future generations would study. Writings shaped historical understanding by emphasizing eyewitness testimony and personal perspective alongside official records. Great Fire also influenced how disasters were explained. Immediate interpretations leaned heavily toward moral judgment and conspiracy. Over time, these gave way to explanations rooted in material conditions, human error, and systemic vulnerability. Evolution reflected broader shifts in scientific and philosophical thought. Fire became an example of how complex events arise from ordinary factors interacting unexpectedly. Culturally, fire entered London's identity as both wound and proof of resilience. It was invoked during later crises, plagues, wars, and other fires, as reminder city had endured worse. Memori ini fostered confidence, but also caution. Londoners learned not to assume permanence. Buildings could fall, systems could fail, preparedness mattered. Rebuilt city, with brick houses and wider streets, stood as visible testament to learning through loss. Each structure embodied choices informed by memory. Even residents who had not lived through fire inhabited spaces shaped by its lessons. Legacy thus passed silently from generation to generation. Beyond London, fire's influence spread through Europe and beyond. Urban planners, architects, and officials studied London's response and rebuilding. While each city faced its own conditions, principles of fire-resistant construction and regulated growth gained wider acceptance. Great Fire became part of broader conversation about urban modernity. Fire also reshaped London's sense of time. Phrase since the fire became common marker, dividing personal and civic histories. This temporal division simplified memory, but also clarified narrative. Fire provided clear turning point, allowing Londoners to frame change as progress rather than decline. Yet, legacy was not uniformly positive. Inequalities persisted and in some cases deepened. Rebuilding favored those with resources. Poorer residents were pushed to margins or crowded into less desirable areas. Fire did not create these disparities, but exposed and sometimes amplified them. Understanding legacy requires acknowledging these uneven outcomes. In legal and administrative practice, fire reinforced the importance of record keeping and redundancy. Lost documents had caused confusion and conflict. In response, institutions became more careful about preserving copies and safeguarding archives. Attention to documentation supported more stable governance. Emotionally, fire left traces harder to measure. Survivors carried memories of heat, noise, and loss throughout their lives. These memories influenced attitudes toward safety and change. Even those born later absorbed stories that shaped perception. Fire became part of London's emotional landscape. Great Fire's legacy also lay in restraint. It taught that disaster need not be framed as spectacle or moral drama alone. Over time, fire remembered with sobriety rather than sensationalism. Tone ini influenced how London approached later challenges, favoring pragmatic response over panic. Perhaps most importantly, fire demonstrated capacity of a city to adapt. London did not simply rebuild what had been lost. It re-examined itself. It asked, implicitly and explicitly, how it might function better. Answers were partial and imperfect, but real. City that emerged from fire was not immune to future disasters. Fires continued to occur. Wars would come. Plagues would return. But London faced these challenges with deeper understanding of its own complexity. Fire had revealed weakness, but it had also revealed strength. In this way, Great Fire became less a story of destruction than transformation. Its legacy was not confined to days it burned or years it took to rebuild. It lived on in decisions, designs, and attitudes that shaped London's evolution. When Londoners walked, rebuilt streets, worked in new shops, and gathered in new churches, they participated in a city informed by memory. Fire no longer visible, but present in brick and law, in habit and caution. Legacy of Great Fire of London is therefore not a single lesson, but collection of insights earned at great cost. It reminds us that cities are fragile, that systems matter, and that recovery is as much about learning as it is about rebuilding. London endured, changed, and continued. That endurance, tempered by experience, stands as fire's most enduring legacy. Dan seiring waktu, lahirlah anak-anak yang tidak pernah melihat fire itu sama sekali. Mereka tumbuh hanya dengan fragments. How the sky once burned. How people fled with what they could carry. How the city stood again. Bagi mereka fire adalah histori, bukan memori. Namun mereka berjalan di streets shaped by it. They lived in houses designed because of it. They benefited from order created in response to it. This is how cities survive. Not by erasing disaster, but by carrying it forward carefully, allowing it to inform rather than define. Great Fire of London became part of city's long story. Bukan akhir sebuah chapter, melainkan momen ketika halaman itu berbalik. London did not return to its old self. It became something more aware, more cautious,